We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. For the record, Jason Robinson, co-chair. Wanted to once again thank the Southern Oregon Land Conservancy and project partners for a great tour and reception last night. I think we had a lot of great discussions. And as Randy mentioned, Southern Oregon hospitality showed true last night as we had a packed house here for the reception. So wanted to thank everybody for that. We're going to start off this morning with public comment. And I have 2 public comment cards this morning. We'll do 5 minutes each on these. So the first is Vanessa Green with the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. Vanessa here yet? She may not be here. She put this in yesterday. So we'll start out then with Sarah Sauter with the Rogue Basin Partnership for 5 minutes. Good morning. Yes. Go ahead and pull it down and state your name for the record for us.
My name is Sarah Sauter. I'm the program manager with the Rogue Basin Partnership, but I'm here this morning on behalf of my hat as the facilitator for the Jackson and Josephine County Cooperative Weed Management Areas. I wanted really to come today to just take the opportunity to thank OWEB for your ongoing support and investment of the work that our CWMA members are doing. In particular, OWEB and the Oregon State Weed Board and ODA's support have gone towards our garlic control efforts. Garlic mustard was first discovered in the Rogue Basin in 2007. It's a huge concern to us because it produces an extremely large seed bank that can lie dormant in the seeds, I'm a little bit nervous this morning. It produces a large seed crop that can lie dormant in the soil for up to 5 years. They can displace the native flora, reduce species richness, and so on. OWEB began investing in our garlic mustard control efforts in 2010. We use that money to employ local contractors to do aggressive treatments, to advise our partners who are doing their own outreach and manual control efforts, and to help us communicate with landowners as they're actually on the properties and doing the treatments. We pay them to have those conversations and do the education and outreach on behalf of our CWMA. I am happy to say that over that 10 years, we have successfully contained garlic mustard to a narrow corridor along the Rogue. We have successfully eradicated it in at least 4 sites and really are focusing on our core population. In 2019, we saw a significant decline in the amount of herbicide that we had to use and the number of plants that we're seeing. We think that this indicates our treatments are working and the seed bank is nearing exhaustion. Depending on spring conditions, we think that 2020 will be the year where we break our record lows in terms of herbicides needed. Continued support from OWEB, the Oregon State Weed Board, and ODA will allow us to continue our support, our work, evaluate our continued success, continue our positive trend, and hopefully share our story with others. We do have a pending application in right now. I think it was submitted in late December. So again, on behalf of the many, many partners of our CWMA, I should have announced myself as that hat last night, but I want to thank you all so much for this. Thank you.
Any questions for Sarah? Thanks for coming this morning, Sarah. I don't see Vanessa.
We could maybe grab her.
Perfect. Okay, we'll put that one on hold. All right, Randy.
Good morning, everyone. Randy Labby for the record. The board, please.
There's Vanessa right there.
Oh,
It's okay.
You still have time.
We're sitting.
forget it.
We'll remain in agenda item N and have Vanessa Green come up with the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils.
Well,
Good morning, Vanessa.
good morning. I apologize for that. Good morning. My name is Vanessa Green, and I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils. And I just wanted to provide a brief comment in regard to the event. I don't recall.
Item S.
Item S, which is about the grant cycle change that is being proposed by OWEB. And I spoke briefly with Eric Williams yesterday, and it's my understanding, he'll go into detail when we actually get to that agenda item. It's it's a little strange to provide comment on something that hasn't happened yet. However, I just want to register that conversation among watershed councils that have spoken with me and among my board, that there is some concern about the change of the grant cycle as it relates to general calendar items such as holiday schedules and when site visits might fall, and especially as it pertains to a 3-month gap that might occur as the shift happens from one cycle to another cycle. And so it was my understanding when I spoke with Eric Williams that he intends to have an engagement phase as this change might occur, to discuss amongst councils how this might affect them. And the purpose of my comment is just to reinforce that concept and to say we fully support the idea of an engagement phase, and that there is some good conversation that needs to happen, as there's some real in the weeds questions of how it might affect people in their work and in their schedule.
Great.
That's my comment.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. Questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks again.
For the record, Randy Labby, and the board, please proceed to tab O. And Andrew Dutter and Ken Fetcho are going to lead us in the tribal management priority setting for FIP priorities.
Co-chairs, members of the board, good morning. For the record, Andrew Dutter, Partnerships Coordinator at OWEB. I'm joined by Ken Fetcho, Effectiveness Monitoring Coordinator and Tribal Liaison at OWEB. And this is agenda item O in your board books, as Randy said. It's essentially a continuation of a discussion that we had at the October meeting related to the 7 board-identified FIP priorities. And as previously discussed, staff initiated a review process of these FIP priorities in September of 2018. Our FIP administrative rules require such a review at least every 5 years. We coordinated with the FIP subcommittee throughout the process, worked closely with agency partners at Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Forestry, and then produced a first set of draft revised priorities for you at the July board meeting in Klamath Falls. We held a public comment period in August and then presented fully revised FIP priorities at the October board meeting in Condon for your consideration of approval. And the board did approve those priorities at that time, but requested additional outreach to Oregon tribal governments to invite any further comment or input on those revised priorities. And so staff began taking steps to engage with tribes soon after the board meeting, and Ken will describe that process here momentarily, and then I'll conclude with a discussion of a few additional proposed revisions specifically to the native fish priority, which is attachment B in the staff report. So, okay.
Thanks, Andrew. For the record, Ken Fetcho, OWEB Tribal Liaison. So shortly after, and I wasn't at the October board meeting, but shortly after, we met with Maida, Andrew, and Eric Hartstein to basically lay out a plan and some next steps to, some meaningful next steps to help engage tribes and seek their input on the ecological priority revisions. And so basically what we did was we sort of crafted this plan where we're going to send out an email with the written materials to get this on their radar. But we really lucked out in the sense that there was 2 face-to-face meetings that were coming on the heels of your board meeting in October. And one of those was the Tribal Natural Resource Work Group meeting, and that was coming up. And so we reached out to the co-chairs of that work group to get on their agenda and had Maida do a PowerPoint presentation. And to prep for that meeting, we used the PowerPoint presentation that was for the October board meeting, but had to add a little bit more background and context because some of the tribes we weren't sure how familiar they were with how the FIP ecological priorities were established in the first place. And so we added some sort of key background information that ensured that was in there. And for those of you who are not aware of what the Tribal Natural Resource Work Group is there are a series of work group and clusters that are actually called for in state statute to help tribal leaders and employees communicate with state agencies. And they are grouped around themes. And so this one's grouped around natural resources, so it was a good fit for what we wanted to talk to and seek tribal input. And so at that presentation, which was on November 19th, Maida presented the presentation. We had handouts for the tribal natural resource employees, and some of them are also directors of their tribal natural resource departments. And we really had just a great conversation, a lot of good dialogue. They asked some clarifying questions, sort of better understand what information was used to establish those priorities, what sort of information was used to think about the revisions, some different priority areas they were asking about. Oregon spotted frog came up, surprisingly enough. And so it gave us an opportunity to have that dialogue with them. And after the meeting, we met with Andrew and Eric Hartstein to better understand some responses that we needed to provide them, because there was a couple questions that Maida and I weren't sure of the answers and wanted to make sure they had the right information. And so as Andrew and Eric were working on sort of those response to comments, those verbal comments, if you will, we attended the annual Tribal Summit on December 2nd. And again, the annual Tribal Summit is also called for in state statute, where the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, which is housed populated by elected officials at both tribal chairpersons and also state legislators. And so those people come together every year, but also every agency of the state government. It's emceed by one of the governor's attorneys, and it's hosted by a tribe. And this year it was hosted by the Confederate Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And so it was a great place for 2 days for all of us to come together. There's a lot of side conversations, so I had an opportunity to just check in with some of the tribes and remind them that we were seeking their input, and also the deadline, which was December 20th, to give us, Andrew and his colleagues, time to figure out how to address the comments. And so on December 11th, we had finalized our written comments. We did a written response to comments based on the verbal feedback that we got from the tribes, and submitted that to them via email, but also reminded them, it's December 11th, holidays are coming up, but remember, December 20th, we really would like your comments on these FIP ecological priority revisions, if you have any. And so on December 20th, we did receive one written comment from Kala Hagel, who is the new Natural Resource Director at the Burns Paiute Tribe, and that was centered around the aquatic habitat for native fish priority. And so with that, I really just want to emphasize sort of the short period of time that we had to seek their input, but I think that we took a lot of meaningful steps and put a lot of thought into it at each step of the way, sort of preparing before we did some outreach, but then after we got some feedback and sort of consider the next steps. And so I really want to thank, Maida and Andrew and Eric Hartstein for helping me sort of implement that outreach. And so now I'll turn it back over to Andrew. He can better describe what the Burns Paiute Tribe comment was and sort of how they handled that feedback.
Okay, thanks, Ken. And for the record, Andrew Dutter, OEB staff. And thank you also for all of your work in the tribal liaison role, thinking about your presentation yesterday and all the efforts you put into this particular project is really outstanding, so thanks. And just a note, too, on the December 20th deadline, that was thinking about Jason's comments yesterday, how tribes tend to be inundated with requests for comments on various things. That was really the absolute sort of drop dead timeline that we could provide and still be able to respond in a timely manner to get information to you for this board meeting. So that's another reason for that December 20th date. So we have 3 additional revisions that we're proposing to the native fish priority as a result of this process. The first, as Ken mentioned, is relative to the comment that we received from the Burns Paiute tribe. And specifically, that comment is in regards to the Upper and North Fork Malheur River subbasins, and in consideration of bull trout populations there, native bull trout. So the tribe had requested that those subbasins be upgraded from the second highest priority designation, or yellow, to the highest priority designation, or green, on the priority map. And again, that's attachment B in your staff report. And I should mention too, the comment can be found as attachment A if you'd like to take a look at that. Originally, those subbasins were deemed yellow because of the large restoration lift required for bull trout in that area, as well as some lack of specificity in the bull trout recovery plan as to the prioritization of core areas in that recovery unit. But the tribe made the case that there has been past and planned restoration work for bull trout in that area. That is described in the documentation that Ken mentioned in the Malheur bull trout plan itself, which is a more localized, specific plan. The area is also culturally significant to the tribe, and so staff took the comments into consideration. We had some follow-up conversation with Kala at the tribe who submitted the comment, conferred with our ODFW partners, and determined that in light of all of that, that area, those subbasins do align better with the highest priority designation, and further affirmed with our ODFW partners that while there's a strong rationale to make the change, there's really no compelling reason or argument not to. And so we have made that change in the native fish map. You'll see that reflected there in the Malheur subbasins. The next revision that staff are proposing is related to lamprey. And this is in past versions of the priority memo, we indicated that lamprey are covered by this priority. Their lamprey-related restoration is eligible for FIP funding, but lamprey were not incorporated into the spatial prioritization of subbasins in the native fish map, simply because it was determined that there wasn't the necessary information to do so, at least at the time that we've gone through this revision process. And so wanting to clarify our policy on lamprey eligibility, we've stated more explicitly in the memo that lamprey-related restoration is eligible anywhere on the map, irrespective of the different color designations. And for context, yellow and green are eligible for FIP funding. Areas that you see in orange are not. And then the third and final revision that we're proposing to the native fish priority is the addition of the term tribal plans to the narrative anywhere that you also see the terms state conservation and federal recovery plans. And similar to the lamprey consideration, the memo previously included discussion that tribal plans were welcomed as the basis or contributing to the basis of any FIP initiative, but we wanted to further highlight the inclusivity of that idea, those plans. So we've included them in the list anywhere that else that you see those other types of plans listed. And I think the very first opening sentence of the priority memo, thanks Ken, is a great example. The OWEB board will consider proposals for investment in initiatives and so on that are identified in a federal recovery, state conservation, or tribal plan. So in summary, the second and third proposed revisions that I outlined are, I think, could be characterized more as clarifications of information that was already in the memo, and then the response to the Burns Paiute comment is a direct change in the native fish memo. And so staff recommend that the board approve the newly revised native fish priority as presented in attachment B.
Thank you. Andrew and Ken, we'll start with board questions for the two of you. Bruce?
Thank you, Chair. Guys, thanks. I'm a little confused on the map itself. Is this an ODFW map or an OWEB map?
Yes.
Yes.
So, that said, is our action also changing the ODFW map?
No, it's an OWEB map that was created in close coordination with ODFW.
So ODFW doesn't use this map for anything?
Not to my knowledge.
No issue. Thanks.
Jamie?
That's
Oh, I'm sorry, Mark.
Mark Labhart for the record. So you mentioned that, but this is the same question for ODF&W. You mentioned that they had reviewed part of it, and then you mentioned that there was a couple other additions, just minor. Has ODF&W reviewed those, and is there concurrence with those?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. For the record, Andrew Dutter, yes. We had our ODFW partners, specifically Chris Lorian, who's the native fish plan coordinator there. I'm not sure I got that title right, but we heard from Chris in October, and he was the point of contact there. Chris did review those other revisions, and I think looped in one or two other staff. I think the statewide lamprey coordinator being one, just to double check and review those other changes.
Great, thank you. Now, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I just want to thank my colleagues on the board for taking the extra time to do this right. I want to very much thank staff for the work you put into it and having those conversations. We were talking yesterday and the last couple of days about our overall vision and the work we want to do in doing this work well. So, and I appreciate the questions from my colleagues, but I think we have the opportunity to have an and map rather than an or map. And so these additional changes and hearing from our key partners is just really, I'm very proud of the work you've done, so thank you.
Jason.
I want to echo what Jamie had said, and first of all, I want to thank Jamie because it was her amendment to the motion last October that really spearheaded a further look and looking at some of the tribal issues in these priorities. So thanks, Jamie, for that, and for staff for doing such a great job. I know your timelines were short, and you jumped on this very quickly, and were able to take advantage of regularly scheduled meetings. So a very good job. Well done. Thanks.
Gary, and then Alan.
Alan Henning for the record. I think this was a very good job that was done to get to where we're at, and I appreciate the work you guys did. I think what did happen, though, is what Jason brought up yesterday is how to get tribal involvement with the amount of pressure that they have in responding to all the needs of all the agencies, all the state organizations, what have you. And we, as a board, may want to give that a little more thought, figure out how we move forward. The tribes have incredible knowledge and value to what we do. We just have to figure out how best to work with them to have them become good, solid players with us.
So for the record,
Maida.
yeah, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, thank you, Alan, for raising that. That was the conversation. I'll put kind of two conversations out there. The conversation that we had with the Natural Resource Work Group, and then separate conversations that I've had with tribal members as I've been going around on the water piece. It has been a very interesting mix. We have some tribes who have a lot of staff in the natural resources area. We have some tribes who don't have as many. What we are hearing is a very interesting phase where I think the agencies, and so we do this for our acquisitions. Our acquisitions go out to the cultural group, they go out to the natural resources group, they go out to tribal council staff. So, and I think agencies across the board have heard the message loud and clear. And so tribes, the feedback we got was a little bit of being overwhelmed by all of the things that they're being asked to give feedback on. And that was from tribes with pretty big staff as well. And so I think you're right. We are really lucky in the natural resource area to have the natural resource work group. Ken will be co-chairing that. This year he's coming in as a co-chair. And I think that's a really good avenue. And I think also as we're learning to be really respectful of what level, is this a thing that needs a council response? Is this a thing that needs staff response, and how do we make sure that, and one of the things we ask them for feedback is, even if they don't have time, that ability for them to just send a response and say, hey, we're not going to be able to respond to this, we're okay with that. And I think that'll help the process as well.
Gary.
Gary Marsh for the record. Thank you, Andrew and Ken. I just had one clarifying as I read through this earlier, and I think you answered it for me. That is a comment on the Burns Paiute tribe that they received. They referred to Malheur River system when they entered their comment, and in the answer to that, or as I read it here, it was in the upper North Fork Malheur River subbasins, and there's three parts of the Malheur River. There's the South Fork, the North Fork, and the Middle Fork. And so I think what was, your conversation with them afterwards probably clarified that they were talking about the upper Middle Fork and the North Fork regions. Is that correct?
For the record, Andrew Dutter, yes, that's correct, Gary, thanks. And so that was part of the conversation, the follow-up that we had with Cala, and those two areas are also consistent with what's included in the bull trout recovery plan that I mentioned and the documentation that she had shared with us.
Thanks.
Very good. Randy Labby for the record. There being no further questions, the chairs would entertain a motion to approve. Jamie?
Thank you. I move the board adopt the revised aquatic habitat for native fish priority for the FIP program as described in attachment B to staff report.
Is there a second?
Jason Robinson, I'll second.
Jason seconds. All in favor signify, please, by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ken and Andrew. So we're going to be moving now to agenda item P in your packets, the Winter Lake Project, and it'll be a partners update. We have Jillian, Ken, Mark, and et al. From the partnership. So see some familiar faces back there.
Yeah, I'll just sit at the end. I'll get right out of the way as soon as I get this.
If you're advancing the slides,
You're driving the bus.
you need to be in the front.
Yeah, it was good conversations.
Okay. Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Jillian McCarthy, Partnerships Coordinator. I won the rock, paper, scissors with Ken and Mark this morning, so I get to sit up here with our lovely partners. This is an informational item to provide an update on the Winter Lake Restoration Project. Our project partners joining us here today, we have Jason Knuckles, the Water Program Manager with the Nature Conservancy. We have Fred Messerly, the Manager of the Beaver Slough Drainage District. We have Mike Gray, ODFW District Fish Biologist, and then Melanie Dunn, the Executive Director of the Coquille Watershed Association. So I'm going to hand it right over to Jason, I believe, to get us started.
Jason Knuckles, for the record. So hello, everyone. Thank you for letting us present this amazing project to you today. And I'm going to start us off with a little background, and we're going to run through We're going to run through some of the project accomplishments and talk about the successes of the project. Fred's then going to take us away and tell us about infrastructure and how the tide gates are functioning in this first year post-implementation. And Michael's going to give us some updates on the restoration efforts as they've taken place. And then Mel's going to share the first year's monitoring with us all. And then we're going to wrap up talking about how this project has leveraged other work in the Coquille Basin and up and down the coast. So this is Winter Lake. It's 1,700 acres of valley bottom, and this is where the site gets its name. In the summertime, this is some of the prime grazing real estate in the state, where the rest of the state's turning brown. This site's staying green. This is also where the site gets its name. In the summertime, it's green. In the wintertime, it overtops. Even with levees and dikes, the entire place turns into a lake for several months. This is where Fred coined the phrase, and we all adopted the phrase, we're able to grow beef in the summer and fish in the wintertime. So here was the project location in the Coquille Basin. We're between the town of Coquille and the town of Bandon, around River Mile 25. The Coquille River has the largest tidal exchange of any river in Oregon, going up to around River Mile 40. Historically, the Coquille had between 300 and 500,000 coho salmon in the basin. We're now down to less than 20,000 on a 10-year running average. What made this an amazing river for these fish is this valley bottom land. And that valley bottom and access to those tidal wetlands is the #1 limiting factor for these juvenile coho and their growth in that stage of life. So over 10 years, this amazing partnership was formed, and they developed and they executed just comprehensive and complex plan. Starting off early with outreach and planning and land acquisition, we then moved into the phases of permitting and fundraising. And then we started implementation, first with the tide gates and the infrastructure. Then we moved into the restoration of the tidal wetland areas. Just recently finished wrapping up revegetation of the site, and right now we're in a maintenance and monitoring mode. Give you a little bit of the lay of the land out there. In the bottom left-hand corner of that blue-purple area there in the center, that's Unit 2. That is where the full restoration took place. The bottom left-hand corner is where the tide gates are located, and these tide gates control the entire 1,700 acres. Unit 1 is private land controlled by that east canal running east to west right there. Unit 3 is both ODFW and private land. That also incorporates the North Dike and Bridge project. These were parallel projects that were necessary for the isolation of Unit 2 and necessary for the full functionality of the entire Winter Lake area. So prior to 2013, ODFW owned no land out in this area. Now, approximately almost 600 acres have been acquired or in the wildlife area. They're providing public access for recreation. They're also providing that improved habitat for fish and wildlife. We've replaced those 4 old, aging, and failing tide gates with 7 state-of-the-art tide gates out there. We reconnected 8.6 miles of tidal channel moving across Unit 2 right there. We've removed 3 miles of interior dikes, and we've improved another 4 miles of dikes out on the property. We filled 1.5 miles of ditches that were no longer functioning, didn't serve any purpose out there. And then we created tidal depressions across the site that provided diversity for habitat, for waterfowl, and for fish. So this is not only the largest tide gate project on the West Coast. This is the largest floodplain tidal restoration project in estuaries in the entire Oregon. So big project. That was a little introduction to the site. Some of you knew a lot of that. Some of you have never been associated with that. Now Fred's going to take it away and tell us about what we're doing with infrastructure.
Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to come and appear before you folks and give you an update on the story of the Winter Lake project. It's an overnight success that took us 10 years to get on the ground. And some of us had more hair and color in our hair than when we started this. But this is really a great project. And on behalf of our landowners and the Drainage District and the rest of our stakeholders, we really appreciate the support that we've had from the OWEB board, and you have been a great partner in this. And I would point out that we're just getting started. This is I think I've said before, this is a marathon, not a sprint. I realize that some of you are new to the process, and so I kind of want to take you through some of the construction challenges that we had, talk a little bit about the system complexity and the scale and capacity, as well as our water management. Jason?
Are you sleeping?
Okay. We ended up with 19 funding sources on this project, as well as the complexity of permitting not only the restoration but the construction and our other items. We had so the complexity of this project, it wasn't simple at all. And for instance, our beginning grade was 16 feet below the field level, and our finished grade on the top when we got done was 16 feet above that level. Some really interesting construction challenges. We also, in addition, had 4 access bridges, as well as the North Dike, that were included in this project. Because if we couldn't tie all this stuff together, we'd have been just not having a complete project. And we literally started our access road out there. We were laying rock or putting fabric down in 4 inches of water and putting rock down, and then moving across that. We only had 120 days to work this project before we had to be out of there by the 1st of October. We made it. So here's a picture of the facility that's completed. What are we going to do now? Well, we've got this tremendous opportunity here. We've got electronics that we're running it with. We can monitor what our levels are and change those levels remotely. But what we found is that this is a very dynamic system. If you change one parameter, water level here, we can independently manage water levels in all 3 units. And we can fine-tune that to meet the objectives of our landowners and stakeholders. But the laws of physics are, you start moving this volume and at this volume and scale, things happen. You close the gates in Unit 2 with an incoming head, and you get 3 waves. It'll run up, it'll come back, it'll run up, it'll come back. Just things that we expected, things that we didn't expect. And so we've had to be very careful about do no harm, and to kind of implement in stages and learn from what we're learning. And it's just been almost too much fun. But you know, the one thing that we've struggled with is the idea that what you're seeing on your data screens, what your system is telling you, how to relate that to what that level is on the ground, so you get a comfort level with it. And we're all learning more about electronics and that sort of thing. It becomes more and more apparent to us as we move into this project and get it working, that this is all about moving water across the landscape. And we need to protect our infrastructure that's there, and in this first 2 years, we have worked really hard to manage our water levels so we can protect the plantings and protect the new dikes and that sort of thing. So as we move forward into the next few years, we'll be able to start scaling up the volumes that we can move and that sort of thing. Seasonal needs for irrigation water, and out of that we found that possibly we created a partial mosquito problem there because we couldn't manage that water inside. These changing parameters and this, we're just going to have to be adaptable. We'll probably be forever adaptable on this, because as the vegetation grows, that will change what may or may not happen. Our landowners have been tremendous, and the other stakeholders have been tremendous in working with us. And you know, the one thing we've learned is that the duck hunters have figured out how to find the information to be able to know how high they want the water. So now we have another group that wants to lobby to change water levels. The point is that this is just the beginning. We're just looking over the edge there, and the possibilities of what we can do with this system for all of our stakeholders, I don't believe we really even realize what that is.
Good morning. I'm Mike Gray. I'm district fish biologist for the Coos, Coquille, and 10 Mile Fish District for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Following construction of the restoration project all summer of 2018, the tide gates were opened on October 11th, and the water flowed in. The channels themselves increase habitat area, but also significantly improve the accessibility for juvenile fish to feeding areas that are adjacent to the channels when flooding occurs. Due to the twice daily flushing of the tide, the project is expected to improve dissolved oxygen levels, decrease summer water temperature extremes, and provide greater accessibility for fish, and a substantial increase in food production for fish and other aquatic organisms. And this can apply to not only the wetland area in the project area, but also out on the Coquille River, improving the water quality. The restoration channels and water management of Unit 2 have significantly increased the use of the ODFW property by wintering waterfowl, and wetland plants including rice and wapato were seeded for improved waterfowl forage. In addition, the area has become a valued public opportunity for the enjoyment of fish and wildlife resources. The water management plan in Unit 2 calls for only the tidal channels to be filled in the summer, gradually increasing water levels in the fall to come out onto the floodplain, and then opening the gates during floods in the winter, gradually decreasing water levels in the spring again, and then returning back to summer levels in the channels. This photo was late November of 2018, just a month after the completion of construction. And all winter of 2018-19, the water levels were reduced in Unit 2 to ensure berm stability and allow for newly seeded soils to stabilize. As a result, fewer salmonids entered Unit 2 that winter. Melanie Dunn from Coquille Watershed Association will provide a summary of the fish survey results later in the presentation. Full implementation of the water management plan is planned for this winter, which should bring more salmonids into Unit 2. In the summer of 2017, ODFW implemented a 30-acre channel restoration and reconnection project in an adjacent drainage area on the drainage district on the ODFW wildlife area. This photo is in mid-March of 2018. A few months later, in the late winter of 2018, 490 juvenile coho were collected in one overnight trap set at this site. A similar number of juvenile coho, 431, were trapped in one night in April of 2019. So if we create or restore this habitat, they will utilize it for feeding and off-channel rearing prior to migrating to the ocean. One of the concerns prior to project implementation was the potential for excessive production of mosquitoes. We consulted with mosquito experts before implementing the project, and they noted that through project design and under the proposed water management plan, we could avoid issues with excessive mosquito production in Unit 2, the restoration area. ODFW and Beaver Slough Drainage District are working together to monitor mosquito abundance and implement strategies to minimize mosquito production, including consistent larval sampling, adjusting water management if needed, addressing ponded water, and larvicide. Management of water on the Unit 2 ODFW lands has reduced the probability of producing adult mosquitoes by keeping water in the channels in the summer. Flooded pasture lands under warmer summer conditions similar to what happened in 2019 are most likely able to rear larval mosquitoes to adulthood in about 2 to 3 weeks. Management strategies that can be incorporated to reduce the potential for adult mosquito production from Unit 1 and 3 lands include reducing early fall or early summer irrigation to reduce multiple mosquito generations, increasing the length of time between irrigation events to dry areas out and reduce adult mosquito production, creating or improving drainage channels in pasture lands to alleviate ponding, and finally, application of larvicide if necessary. In 2019, late spring flooding, warmer temperatures, and a lack of strong summer winds resulted in higher overall production in parts of Coos County and increased mosquito interactions with humans, including the project area. ODFW began mosquito monitoring at project and reference sites in 2014, a few years prior to the restoration project implementation. Although the numbers of adult mosquitoes trapped were higher overall in 2019 as compared to previous years sampled, trapped numbers on Unit 2 were in the lower range of the sampled sites. Management of water on the Unit 2 ODFW lands, again, reduces the probability of producing adult mosquitoes by restricting water primarily to the channels in the summer. Channels that are flushing twice daily with the tides are not susceptible to producing mosquito larvae, and they are also full of various species of fish and amphibians that feed on larval insects. Larval sampling in Unit 2 detected a small acreage, about 1/2 acre, where early stage larvae were being produced. One of our staff hand-dug small drainage channels to help drain out those ponded areas prior to the mosquitoes being able to reach late stages or fly off as adults. And we also worked with the Beaver Slough Drainage District to lower water levels to drain those areas. For 2020, the planned actions include sampling consistently again for adults and larvae, have ODFW staff with pesticide applicators license should larvicide application be necessary, and following ODFW's vector control protocol for sensitive areas, which includes triggers for larval treatment or other actions. I want to thank the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board for the support on this project, and this has been a very rewarding project to work with the number of partners that we have, and at this time I'd turn it over to Melanie Dunn.
Great, thank you. So I will be covering the monitoring elements of the project today. So I wanted to start initially and just acknowledge our staff member, Julie Huff, who's really spearheaded getting the monitoring effort on the ground. She couldn't be here today, but I wanted to throw that kudos out to her. So I'm going to start by covering the monitoring and adaptive management plan. This was created as part of the permitting requirements for the project. The monitoring and adaptive management plan is being implemented by the Coquille Watershed and ODFW. We are monitoring the physical habitat characteristics at the site, including channel complexity, water quality, floodplain vegetation, as well as fish passage at the site. All that to say, we are collecting a lot of data at the site throughout the year. So what I'm going to cover is really just skimming the surface. We come out with an annual report every year on the results of the monitoring. That's actually just been published in January. So if you're interested in learning more, we have 100 pages of more information out there for you on our website. And I also wanted to acknowledge we have a monitoring committee of over 10 organizations that meet quarterly to review the status of the project and methods and review data collected as well. So this is a snapshot of the portal that Fred had mentioned earlier in the presentation, where we can see real-time data on a number of parameters that we're monitoring, including water level, tide gate door openness, velocity, and a few other parameters as well. This is a figure as an example of our temperature and dissolved oxygen monitoring on the site. We have loggers deployed at 7 different locations throughout the site. Really, our water quality sampling in the first year has been great to establish a baseline. We expect to see improvements as the riparian vegetation matures and establishes over the coming years. So really, the first year was about getting a solid baseline of data to compare future year changes. This is an example of our photo point monitoring we're doing on the site. Even just 1 year, after 1 year, you can see a lot of improvement. Year 1 was taken less than a month after the restoration was completed on the site. Just a year later, you can see the vegetation has already started to establish. It's fully grassed. So we're seeing some major improvements even just after 1 year. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about our fish monitoring at the site, looking at the fish response to the restoration project specific to juvenile coho response on the site. So our main research question is, has the juvenile coho condition factor and relative abundance improved in Unit 2 compared to the ag units, as well as compared to a reference site, which is located in Beaver Creek, which is adjacent to the project area. We sample on a weekly basis. We set hoop traps and deploy them overnight, and then we will count and identify all fish, and then specific for juvenile coho, we will measure their length and weight, and then pit tag them for mark recapture efforts to evaluate population estimates as well as overwinter growth. So this slide is, we're really excited to share this data with you all. This slide shows fish that were sampled from 4 different sampling locations, one being actually from the Smith River, which is the large tributary to the Umpqua. ODFW has a life cycle monitoring site up there, which is a riverine system. And then we have 3 locations that were sampled in the Coquille Valley, again at the in ag units, in the Unit 2 restoration site, and then also in the Beaver Creek site. And so really the major take home here is and I know it's kind of hard, they're kind of small on the screen. So we have a cluster at the near the bottom of the figure where there's a fish with a lower condition factor, and those are actually all the riverine reared fish from the Smith River. So you can see that the floodplain reared fish actually have a better condition factor than the riverine reared. And then also very exciting, within the fish that we've sampled in the Coquille Valley, all floodplain reared, Unit 2 fish were all had the highest condition factor. So we are seeing that Unit 2 is producing fish that are better suited and more likely to survive as they outmigrate. So we're really excited to see these results just after 1 year. We're in the middle of year 2 sampling, so we're really excited to also start comparing and contrasting as the restoration site heals up and continues to produce additional fish. So now we're transitioning to wrap up the presentation, and we wanted to end really focusing on how this project has served to leverage additional efforts in the Coquille as well as more broadly statewide. This project has really served as a catalyst for a number of initiatives that we're excited to share about. So specific to the Coquille Valley, we've implemented additional tie gate replacement and tideland restoration projects, working with other ranch landowners, and we've been able to implement the lessons learned from the Winter Lake project to continue to hone these types of projects and continue to improve as we implement additional projects. Also wanted to highlight that we are expanding our partnership with ODFW. We have 2 pending grants, one with OEB to expand our monitoring effort in the Coquille Basin, looking at fish response to the multiple tide gate replacement and tideland restoration projects. And then lastly, I'm participating as a Network of Oregon Watershed Council's representative on the Tide Gate Partnership at the statewide level, so we're able to to share information and input at that level as well.
From the Beaver Slough Drainage District's perspective and our landowners' perspective, typical to most drainage districts everywhere, this system was designed, our interior infrastructure was designed by committee over the last 100 years, and it doesn't fit the capacity that we've started to build into these systems, and particularly into this system. A considerable investment has been made here in a tide gate structure, but unless we can get the interior infrastructure to where it can utilize that capacity, we're not going to get the return in investment either to our ag producers or the habitat values out of that we need to. It's all about being able to move water at volume. And if you've got a culvert that's too small or your ditches are plugged up inside, it's just self-defeating. And so that is probably our biggest challenge on the ground moving forward, is the permitting process and that interior infrastructure to go along with the good work that we've done on the tide gate. So as I said, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
And I just wanted to wrap up saying that tide gates are having their day right now. I liken this to what was happening with culverts maybe 30, 40 years ago, when awareness and opportunity started coming. And there's more awareness of tide gates and the problems and the opportunities on the coast right now than ever before. You know, OWEB is leading the Tide Gate Partnership. That's now up to maybe 60 organizations or so, focusing on things like inventory to know exactly what our problems and solutions are up and down the coast. You are funding a decision support tool that's going to help us know where to put money on the ground for our largest ecological uplift. We're making headway on regulation and engineering problem solving. Business Oregon just received $6 million to put towards tide gates. Pacific Marine Estuary Partnership is putting together a multi-state tide gate conference this year, hosting it here in Oregon. And there are more tide gate projects, like Mel mentioned, up and down the coast than ever before. So these are just a few of the highlights. And when we started Winter Lake, none of this was happening. So say special thanks to OWEB, especially to staff for their hard work, their perseverance, their patience with us maybe over the last 10 years. And we also want to recognize the late Jim Seeley of Wild Rivers Coast Alliance for everything that he did. This project wouldn't have happened without him. Thank you all. We're open to questions. I think we did it in 29 minutes.
All right. Mark.
Okay, Mark Labhart, first of all, great presentation. It goes to show what can happen when people work together across agencies and landowners. I want to particularly thank you, Fred. You gave me a tour of the project. It's been a part of a day out there showing me around. I also want to recognize Steve Denny in the back of the room. Steve Denny is a retired ODF&W regional biologist, and I think had a significantly key role in helping to move this project forward. So I have a couple questions. I think you mentioned there was 19 partners involved in this project. What was the total cost of the project, not including the continuation, like monitoring and those kind of things? What was the amount, if you put it all together, what did it cost?
The 19 was 19 funding sources.
Okay.
And let me tell you, every one of them had a different take on how they want it reported. We're still working on that one. You know, in general, up to the monitoring effort, the total on the whole thing was just both the infrastructure, the tide gates, the access infrastructure, North Dyke. That part of it was a little over $5 million, about somewhere between $2 and $2.5 million on the Unit 2 restoration. And then the balance of that, up to about $10 million, was the permitting, just the design and startup costs, and there was some land acquisition involved with that.
Okay.
Now, that appears to be a big dollar amount, but you also got to realize that that's spread over a big landscape. There's a lot of acres there. So our dollar per acre investment in this project, if you take all of the different aspects of it, on a dollar per acre aspect and the uplift you're getting, it's actually very efficient.
Okay, and so probably a question for Jillian. What did we contribute to that of the 19 in terms of, and not including monitoring? And I'm not doing this from a critical standpoint. I'm just curious, you know, these projects are very expensive. And we spent $12 million on the Tillamook project, you know, the Southern Flow Corridor. They're very expensive.
We need Fred's spreadsheet.
We do. We do. For the record, Jillian McCarthy, I won't be able to give you an exact number. The breakdown, so we had OWEB, lottery dollars, state dollars invested in the project, and we also had several coastal wetland grants, which are federal dollars through U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that OWEB subgrants out. And so my very rough estimate of those sources would be somewhere around $3 million, but that's including the federal dollars, probably a bit upwards of $3 million.
Okay, Randy and then Alan.
For the record, Randy Labby. I'm just curious how many obsolete tide gates there are now in the Coquille system.
I can field that one for the record, Melanie Dunn. We have an inventory completed, and we have about 120 tide gates. And that inventory was just of where, you know, we had either had access or what we could see from the boating in the main stem. So likely there's also interior tide gates that are not factored into our inventory. We have replaced 2 tide gates in the Coquille in addition to the Winter Lake project. We're working on another big effort actually in Beaver Creek, which is currently our reference site for sampling for the monitoring effort. And then we have a stakeholder engagement grant that's currently open in partnership with the Coos Watershed Association and Coos SWCD to engage additional landowners that have tide gates in these projects if they're interested. Everything obviously we do is on a voluntary basis. So most of the tide gates are still in need of upgrade to meet current fish passage regulations.
Thanks.
Alan?
Alan Henning for the record. Fred, you had mentioned that this is a marathon. Do you have a strategic plan that lays out the geography for the marathon course so that you can incrementally move forward to complete the course?
Well, yes, our landowners are definitely very interested in getting this interior infrastructure up to speed so that they can get utilization of being able to move water across the landscape, of course. And we're working very closely with the Soil and Water Conservation District as well as ODF&W to get into the permitting phase. So that right now that is our holdup is that it's probably more a matter of getting the permitting taken care of. Our landowners would do a lot of the work on their own dime. They may look for some help from some of the programs to like buy a culvert or something, but installation, ditch maintenance, that sort of thing, restoring some of the historic channels to where we can move that water back and forth more efficiently. Our landowners will take on a lot of that on their own.
But is there this is Alan Henning again, do you have a strategic plan that captures all of that? So somebody could take a look at the big picture. This is part of the big picture. But what you're also saying about involvement of other landowners and what needs to be done there, is that captured in a broader strategic plan that lays out the nuts and bolts of this whole area that's needed for this whole area?
Not a definite one. That's part of what we're actually working on as we speak. A part of that will be the permitting process. We'll develop that information and kind of tie it all together.
Got it. Thank you.
This is Jason Nichols. This figure here that Fred shared with you was developed by the Soil and Water Conservation District, and that's a snapshot of some of the preliminary design work for all of the maintenance and enhancement that the district is looking at.
And I'd point out that what we're really trying to do here is mimic what nature did. We came along and put these restrictions, tide gates and culverts and stuff into this system, and then over time it's basically sized itself to those restrictions. Now, as we've learned more about the systems and the importance of this interior part of the system, we're realizing that we've got to go back and come to that capacity, if you will, inside to be able to take advantage of what nature will do on its own, but we don't have 100 years to wait for nature to put it back that way. We're in a hurry.
For the record, Jason Robinson, I just wanted to make a note. I remember, Fred, back in 2010, you and Steve Denny and I was at the Coquille Tribe at the time. We had sat down and we had a map with LiDAR imagery on it, and you said, what if? What if we could do something here in this watershed? And it's amazing 10 years later to see what that what if has accomplished. And I know the hard work and effort that it's been to get there. So, appreciate the opportunity to be a part of that early on, but also to see how you have continued to push that with Steve in a tremendous partnership to see this come to fruition. So thanks for that, Jamie.
Thanks, Jamie McLeod Skinner. Really impressive project, great presentation. Thank you very much. And it's exciting, the sense of the investment that OEB and others do in partnerships. It really builds up that foundation for future success. So thanks for talking about that as well. I'm curious about two things. One, the first is about kind of the learning that you've done. You talked about some of the things, having to adapt things as you go. I was wondering where you might have looked for other best practices. I'm thinking about tide gates. Holland comes to mind. And so as you're looking at this transition from folks on culverts to tide gates and this opening up, are there other best practices and other ideas we're bringing in to really learn from others who may have done this before us?
I can speak to project manager. You want to say something about tide gates in general?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say just as the partnership was developing, I came on midway through, support Steve Denny. Steve Denny was on his 4th, 5th retirement, whatever that was, I can't keep up, is that the trust that needed to be developed between the partners because of the understanding of each person's objectives, which were slightly different, and then realizing that objectives can overlap in a way that enhances everyone. We can get to a common shared goal. And every partnership, every large project like this with a vision starts off with this broad suite, and you realize they have to come together, but it's all built on trust. And I would put that as lesson learned number 1 in any report, anytime.
Yes.
A little more to the mechanical side of it. For instance, we struggled, we came up at a hard spot in the design part of this thing when the ologist, if you will, said, we got to have fish access in the wintertime here. A conventional tide gate is closed when the water comes up. We struggled with that, and then just the physics of trying to close a side hinge tide gate with a couple feet of head on it is going to tear everything apart. So we came up with slide frame gates. Nobody had done that in a tide gate application. The key to this whole thing, and it kind of comes back to your point, Jason, is that we never quit talking to each other. Sometimes it was pretty tense, but we always went back, and invariably we found a win-win situation. And so you got to be really open-minded, and this is a work in process. But I think that not only some of the mechanical things that we've done here, but to Mel's point here about the monitoring, that is so important to be able to figure out and to be able to tell this story in a very accurate way based on the data that's generated. Because the next one of these is going to be easier to do because we're going to know what we're talking about. And I think that it's just so important that that effort not be abandoned, because historically the monitoring money's been the first thing to go because you didn't need it to make the water stop.
Well, and thanks, just following up on that point, because it's the geeky engineer in me. When I saw some of the designs, some questions were coming to mind, and I especially was wondering about maintenance. So it looked like there was some really silty soil, and then if you have a design system where you've really created more of a system, are there going to be, this kind of ties in a little bit to Alan's question about maintenance, but are there going to be additional challenges that come up, and have those been thought through so that we can maintain these sensitive systems? It's a really impressive design that we've come up with, but is it going to create, are we going to see bigger challenges that we otherwise might have seen, and do we need to be thinking ahead in terms of how we maintain these systems?
Almost universal because, excuse me, you know, since we've had fish passage rules now for 15 years, nobody has, and particularly with the listing of the coho, there's been very little maintenance of these interior systems. And so now we've got almost a dual thing to deal with. We've got to rebuild these systems because they're not even functional. And then we get into maintenance. And how do we maintain them? I can tell you from what I'm seeing is that if we can move the water in the volumes, a lot of this maintenance will become self-maintaining. And the whole system will become either that, or it'll change those maintenance intervals. It'll double. Instead of 5 to 7 years, it could be 15 to 20.
Barbara?
Did you want to add?
I was going to add, we did size these channels, learning from historic tide gate projects and historic tidal restoration projects. We sized these channels to mimic those historic sizes of channels so that we would get that ecological uplift sooner as opposed to later. We could have gone in there and notched. We could have gone in there and started the process and, like Fred said, allow nature to do the work over 20 or so years. But we would expect less maintenance in the channels because of all the earth moving that happened during the restoration phase.
Barbara Boyer. Sorry. As a Soil and Water Conservation District board member, I know the difficulties of getting such a large project on the ground with private landowners. And I see that it's 1,300 acres of private landowners. How many landowners is that?
The district actually has 29 landowners, but 95% of the land is owned by 5 landowners.
5, okay.
So, and it's those 5 that of course, drainage districts, they operate on acreage, not on people. And so we've got a lot of minority stockholders that we have to deal with. But the main part is involved with those 5 landowners.
Thank you.
Any other questions before Maida does a quick wrap up? Oh, go ahead, Gary.
Gary Marshall for the record. Impressive. But I just have a question, kind of follow up on Jamie's there. That so what kind of structures in place to deal with the maintenance of this as time goes on? Is this think about some kind of association with landowners and agencies to share cost or responsibilities?
The drainage district owns and operates the infrastructure, the tide gates and the canals and all of that on behalf of the landowners who are the drainage district. That being said, this, I believe, was one of the first projects that it was mandated that we have a water management plan. And so we've got a water management plan that calls for how we're going to manage water. That has stakeholder input into it. All of our stakeholders, regulators, permitting agencies all have input into that. But ultimately, it's the drainage district's responsibility. It was important to our landowners from the get-go, Steve will tell you from the first meeting ever, that the control of this project stayed local with the landowners. And of course, we've built into that process to take input, but and of course, there's limitations because of the grant money that's involved. That adds more to it. But that water management plan, which has a mechanism in it to adapt as time goes on, is really important, because this project in 20 years won't look like it does today.
I can add to that as well. Again, Melanie Dunn, for the record. As I mentioned, we've taken a lot of lessons learned from this project, and one of those being in the design and engineering phase, when, not just with Winter Lake, but with other tide gate and tideland restoration projects. We often, at the end of a channel network, will dig a hydrologic bulb, which you can kind of see is depicted on that screen as those red areas, and that allows for, as the tide caps at its highest, the water will fill that up and then flush it out. So that will help maintain and keep the channel network cleared much better than historically, when channel ditch networks were linear and often, incised and too small, so that exacerbated silting in, and they needed to be dug a lot more regularly. So we expect that with this design feature, that will help keep it flushed. Additionally, all the culverts, most of the culverts were undersized in the first place, so that was a constriction point. So now that they're actually sized properly, the flow is it allows for that maintenance to kind of be self-maintaining in a lot of ways. And to add as well, when we engage landowners in these projects, we have long conversations about the maintenance and what that commitment will look like. Often it's less than what they have to do now, so there's a good buy-in from that. But we do have that conversation of, this is what you're committing to maintain this functionality. Since there are public dollars going on to private property, we have to protect those resources on their land. And that's definitely a conversation we had, that this project has helped inform and help refine those conversations for future projects.
Maida.
All right, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, there were a whole bunch of things going through my head as I watched this, having seen this project for quite some time. I won't put all of them out in front of you right now, but one of the things that Fred didn't mention, I'm looking at Steve as well, that I think is incredibly important. I think if I remember right, last count, you guys held about 300 public conversations around this project. What they didn't mention, because we're sitting in year 10, is the incredible amount of contention in the local community, and how well this team of folks handled that by good public process, by engaging folks locally, by really being thoughtful and responsive, by involving all of the local partners, by keeping it local. And so for me, this is one of those examples. And there are places where it is perfect and everything runs smoothly, and this had every challenge that could be thrown at it, and we've come out with an amazing project. I wanted to highlight a couple of things. Fred was much less direct with this board today than he often is in talking about the importance of those internal features, and he mentioned the fact that if those aren't working right, the rest of the system isn't working. What Fred often reminds us of, and it is a challenge that OWEB has as well, is it is very hard to get funding for that stuff. The stuff that makes this system work is not the flashy, really cool tide gate or the purchase of the ODF&W property. Those things are flashy and cool, and we like to invest in them. The incredible amount of money and effort that goes into those interior drainage systems, and it's hard with our review team and others to get funding for that type of work. So just something to keep in your head, that we as funders often love the flashy stuff, and the real work takes place in the marathon. And I also want to really thank Mel and the work that you and the other watershed associations have been doing in that area. It's a different conversation, I think, now than it was before because of the stakeholder engagement that you all have been doing. So a huge thanks to all of you. I think the OWEB person who actually stuck through this thing all the way through is Mark Grinbemmer in the back of the room. I think we've had 4 project managers on this grant itself over the time period, and Mark has been steady hand for us, so thanks, Mark.
Great. Liza Jane.
Liza Jane McAllister for the record. You talked about the willingness of private landowners to fund the interior work or participate. They're supporting, and through all the projects that I hear a big value for, we can't do this without private landowners, and yet I rarely see them listed. I don't see them recognized, and I think there's, I don't know if they'd be willing, but there's value in that because maybe people would change their idea of what a landowner's values are when they see their name up. Maybe other people would get on board because they see their name up. Same as when you donate to somewhere, they'll list, the people that donate, and then the rest of the people go, oh, I want my name on that list. So even if there's just a broad private landowners across the bottom, maybe recognizing that will get more people involved because they're critical to success, long-term and short-term. Just a thought.
That's Fred Messerly, for the record. That's a good thought. Vicariously, through the drainage district, our landowners are represented, but a lot of landowners, they want to be kind of back a level and don't really want or feel that they need the publicity out there. And so it's really a challenge because every landowner, every family is going to have a different outlook on that. It's a great point, but Maida, we're somewhere between 450 and 500
Oh my goodness.
contacts and tours, and it's really important. This project is matured enough now to where we can start talking and taking this story on the road, if you will. And I think it's a great story to tell.
Real quick for the record, Jason Robinson, a question for Mike with regards to long-term monitoring. I think the goal of all of these projects is to, at some point in time, get coho back to production levels where we can see them thrive. At one point in time, there was some calculations that were being put together on production of these types of habitat restoration projects in terms of total outputs. Is the information from China Creek coming in and being used to continue to kind of refine those models or outputs to show, per acre what we can accomplish in terms of out migrants or better condition class or those sorts of things?
Yeah, Mike Gray from ODFW. Yeah, Jason, you're right. There was a study that we had Tom Nicholson, who had retired from ODFW with years in monitoring habitat and coho production when he was with ODFW. We had him basically looking through documents, studies, and came up with, in this report that he did, an estimate, and it was something like 11 to 17 additional adult coho salmon per acre that were restored. And so then we were able to kind of do a rough expansion of what that might mean for additional adult coho on an average or a peak year of returns. And to your question about the monitoring, we're just real early on here. So yeah, we're going to be definitely learning, adapting. That's the thing about the water management plan. It's meant to be a living document, an adaptive process. And how do we manage the water to best get the fish in there, make sure they get out? That's the important thing too about the internal infrastructure, if we're going to be able to not only in the wintertime utilize and show the uplift from the Unit 2 restoration unit, but also from the overall 1,700 acre, all three units. Make sure that we have in place what's needed to get that uplift. But I think also our point that we made in the presentation that first winter of 2018, 2019, that first winter water levels were somewhat reduced because we had a lot of bare soils out there, so we had to make sure that everything stabilized and the berms stabilized, and so that first winter was not necessarily what we're seeing as normal as moving into the future or what we'll be doing. So, but the exciting thing is to be learning from what's been done out here and to use that in the future when other tide gate projects all up and down the coast are moving ahead.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Jillian.
Randy Labby for the record. We're going to move to tab Q, which you note is a funding action item. Water acquisition grant awards, and Jillian McCarthy is going to stay up and be joined by Eric Williams.
Yeah, I was still on board when that started.
Okay, for the record, Jillian McCarthy. We're going to switch from tide gates to water acquisitions. Casey Markowitz was intending to join us today, and she has had an injury and is unable to sit up here with us, so I'm going to do my best to describe these projects and field any technical questions that you might have on them. This is an action item for the Water Acquisition Grant Program. The Water Acquisition Grant Offering, it's an annual offering that funds the transfer of water rights to in-stream uses through a variety of mechanisms. This could be permanent in-stream transfers or in-stream leases or other water use agreements, like we've seen minimum flow agreements or forbearance agreements in the past. And the intention is to increase in-stream flow to benefit habitat, species, and water quality. Typically, you see this come before you in April. The offering usually goes out in the fall with a winter deadline and board awards made in April, but that is very close to the start of the irrigation season for many irrigators, and often resulted in delays of the project by a full year. And so, based on feedback from our grantees, we shifted it. So we're here in January, which should give irrigators sufficient time between when board awards are made and when they would start irrigating to have to plan. And so what you'll see is there were only 2 applications that were received this cycle, but I have been assured by our applicants that that is not an indication of need, that it just simply was that there was a shorter duration between cycles. So with the 2 projects, I guess what I'll do is pause here first to see if there are any questions in general on the Water Acquisition Grant Program, since this might be the first time for some of you that it's before you.
Barbara.
Barbara Boyer. So the shifted timeline, how was that for you? Was it enough time for you as staff?
It was enough time, yes.
Okay.
We made it happen. Thank you.
Eric.
Eric Murray for the record. Regarding the permanent transfer to in-stream rights, recent conversations with OWRD indicate that that process has become, or has always been, I guess, in a way, so uncertain. how does that affect sort of your view of the long-term benefit of that type of transfer?
So for the record, Jillian McCarthy, I think that there's a very long process that Water Resources goes through to verify the reliability and the validity of the water. And so through that process, it can change the amount of water that will actually go in stream. So in terms of our granting, which may not be quite the question you asked, but we're seeing these before, as a proposed amount of water in stream before it goes through, typically before it goes through that review through Water Resources. And so for the board, the numbers you're seeing and awarding funding on may not be the amount of water that actually goes in stream. And so that is the way our program and the timeline is set up. I guess maybe it creates more of a risk or vulnerability in the investment of funds, because you might think you're going to get 1 CFS, for example, and it ends up being slightly less than that based on the review of water through Water Resources.
All right, this is Eric again, just a quick follow-up. So is it reasonable to assume that, if you're paying for a lease in the interim, that before the in-water right becomes permanent, that you're getting something close to the amount at the point at which you begin to compensate the water user?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question about.
Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, I think I understand your question. And actually, this is a part of what we're having a conversation about it in rulemaking. So catch me if I'm wrong, but so your question is, to Jillian's point, if we assume 1 CFS and it ends up being 0.9, for example, are we reasonably assured that we're within the range when we start paying the landowner?
Exactly, yes.
For permanent acquisitions, currently we don't pay them until final order. And but we are having a conversation in rulemaking, or did we decide not to?
We decided not to.
We are not having a conversation in rulemaking.
We had a conversation, but we finished the conversation and
By
decided not to include that in the rule.
I think that was I think I did that. So yeah, we don't pay until final order. So then we do know what that right is on permanent. Different conversation for some of the programs that are more fluid or not a permanent acquisition.
Yeah, so as quick follow-up to Maida's comment, Jillian McCarthy for the record, where there are transactions that go through Water Resources, permanent transactions or in-stream leases, we will not pay the landowner the payment to the landowner until we receive the final orders. We also have other sort of monitoring and verification that the transaction, if it is something different, has gone through and the landowner has met the terms of that agreement before we will issue the landowner payment. We will, with our grantee, if for staff time or other programmatic costs associated with the transaction, we will pay those as they come up, but the landowner payment is only made after the transaction's been assured.
Jamie?
Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I appreciate that the action before us is specific to 2 potential projects and issuance, but I also had some questions about the bigger picture process, and I recall having some of these conversations last year as well, and I just wanted to float the idea if this might not be a good thing to take to a committee discussion, whether it's the Water Committee or another, to talk a little bit about the approach and process, even the policy goals. So even prior to the rulemaking piece of how we do it, is to have this kind of bigger picture process piece and what's included, not included. And I say this apart. I worked as an environmental planner for Regional Water Agency for 5 years, and looked at, it's just so complex. We're looking at some of the water transfer things. There's so many issues involved in this discussion. And so it's not the action before us to have that discussion here, but I thought this might be a great opportunity to refer this to committee to have that fuller discussion. It might, and maybe even bring it back to the board to provide some policy direction that would feed into staff's work in terms of rulemaking.
For the record, Maida Lofsgarden, two components of that. One, staff did have a conversation about the appropriate place to place the water acquisition conversations in committee, and our recommendation is it actually be the acquisitions committee. And that is because, as you guys defined it in October, the acquisitions committee will look at both policy and applications. And so we feel there's space in that committee to have that conversation around both water and land. And the reason I raised that is as you were thinking about what committees you might want to serve on, knowing that those two components are specifically there. The other thing I will mention, we are in a required 5-year rulemaking, nearly done with it right now on the water acquisition program. So we will actually be bringing final rules before you after public comment in April. So we're a little bit kind of off cycle, I think, for the conversation that you want to have because we're nearly done with that piece. However, in that conversation, we had an amazing group of partners. There is a lot of that. You'll see a lot of that policy framework, even though it might not be outlined specifically in rule, that guides those component of rules for the type of things we fund and public benefits. So it may be well worthwhile, Eric and Jillian, in between, because it won't have time to move to committee, to have a conversation with Jamie because of her vast experience in this area to really talk through that detail so we don't miss an opportunity in this time window to have that feedback, if that's okay with you.
Alan and then Bruce.
Alan Henning for the record. Jamie, you took the words right out of my mouth. It was what I was wanting to get to is how we deal with acquisitions on the big picture, water acquisitions, how it sits into the acquisition committee framework, because this is kind of outside of that framework right now, and I know we're trying to figure out how it's all going to work, but your points are spot on, and figuring out how we deal with acquisitions, how we look at them, how we review them, who's involved with that before it actually gets to the board for discussion and vote. I know we've got to figure that out, but.
Bruce and then Mark.
Having only been in Oregon for 30 years, I don't understand the water stuff yet. And I'm not sure how long you have to be here to understand it. How senior is senior, those sort of things. I read it. I read the 15-mile application, and I wondered if it was really technically a water acquisition at all. And how it fit. So, and then I listened to Jamie, and I think I agree 100% that these are things that need to be done. I would love to see a review, a review of past acquisitions and how well they have performed. You know, we anticipated this, we paid this, this is how it's played out. In review, this was the value. Did we get the value we assumed we would get? What value did we get instead? Better, worse, etc. Those type of historic things would at least help me have a level of confidence that making current decisions that we're on the right path. So.
Yeah, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, if it's all right, I'll respond to that too. So I appreciate what's being raised in this conversation, and I think probably Alan and Debbie might be the only two folks. On regular intervals, this tension comes up with the board. So I'm remembering back to a meeting we had in Klamath Falls where the board we brought in some outside experts to do the exact conversation you're having, because every few years as our board shifts, there's this, because water acquisitions in particular are so rare and such a small part of our portfolio. So we have no problem having that conversation again. I think it's important, and we've had these questions come up before, so we've brought in some great outside expertise to help us. They helped us understand valuation at that point in time. How do you actually value these transactions? And I think Jillian might be going to this when she talks about the review, but we do want you to know that we have a pretty extensive review process with partners who are experts in this area. And so what we can do, I think you'll talk about it a little bit in the presentation, but I saw staff taking notes. Go ahead and amp it if you only had a little piece, because I think it's important to understand who we partner with for the reviews and how that goes. But we have no problem bringing this kind of that bigger context back to you all, because again, I think there might only be two of you who were around when we were having these conversations previously. So happy to have that. And again, before April, we can talk about what the kind of the policy piece behind the current rulemaking process as well. So I understand the angst with something that doesn't come up as often.
Thank you. Mark?
Mark Labhart, so I'm going to dive right into the weeds. So both of these applications have conditions tied to them. Have the conditions been reviewed by the applicants, and are they okay with those conditions and will comply with the conditions if we approve this?
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, the applicants have seen the conditions. They have not raised any issues with them. They've seen the conditions as written in the evaluations that have been made available to them. They've not raised any issue with that. But there's further conversation to have depending on whether you choose to award funding to them or not. And this pause was, I didn't think there'd be that many questions. And so we will get into more details on the actual projects themselves, the individual projects.
That can happen now. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Liza, sorry about
Just one. This is Liza Jane for the record. I love the 15-mile project. I didn't know that existed. And what I love about it is it's flexible and it's adaptable, and that's how my understanding of nature is. And so the condition that says we want longer term, something stable, that it just doesn't always fit. So I really like that. I'm excited to hear how that goes.
So why don't I dig a little bit more into the projects themselves, and we can talk a bit about how these are evaluated, it sounds like. So we partner we have a contract with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, with NFWF. They have their Columbia Basin Water Transaction Program that funds very similar projects to this, water transactions for in-stream uses. Through that, they have a technical advisory committee, and their technical advisory committee is made up of NOAA staff, ODFW staff, various agency staff. They also have water right experts and lawyers and water evaluation economists that they utilize for these projects to make sure that the value of the water that is proposed for that particular area makes sense. In different areas, the value of the water can be very different. And so they meet, we work with them to review these applications. One thing that did come out in through the Rules Advisory Committee was the suggestion that in addition to utilizing the Technical Advisory Committee with NFWF, that we also involve more regional staff. So while they have great expertise in the Columbia Basin, a lot of these transactions are outside of the Columbia Basin. And so working with local ODFW fish biologists and water masters and others who can help us understand if this is the right water in the right place at the right time will help give us some insight and give you some insight into whether or not these investments you feel are worth making. So with that, I'd like to,
Sorry.
Barbara?
Question on the screen. So the in-stream leases, I don't recall this, does OWEB do the CREP in-stream leases? I can't remember who does those.
Yes, so through the CREP program, if a producer has land that they typically irrigate and they are enrolling that land in CREP, then they can get an irrigated rental rate if they lease that water in stream. Yes, so it's the same process that that these in-stream leases have to go through with water resources.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's get into the projects then. So again, there were 2 applications that were received, requested just over $156,000 total. And the first project is 220-9900, which is the Mill Creek Water Rights Acquisition. This is a permanent transaction proposed by the Deschutes River Conservancy. They're requesting $46,502. Mill Creek is a tributary to Ochiko Creek and the Ochiko Reservoir in the Crooked River Subbasin. It's just outside of the city of Prineville. And this is a snowmelt-driven watershed. So once snow is melted in the upper reaches of the watershed by about mid-July, flow in the creek drops and remains low throughout the irrigation season. Mill Creek frequently dries before reaching the Ochiko Reservoir in late summer months, and any water that's available is diverted from the creek by senior water right holders. This project seeks to add up to 0.66 CFS of protected senior in-stream flow to Mill Creek, and this will extend the period of connectivity with the Ochiko Reservoir to improve in-stream habitat for native red-band trout. There are 3 water rights associated with this transaction, but they're all held by the same owner. There are about 163 acres associated with those 3 water rights, and the water right holder would like to permanently transfer the water associated with 60 of those 163 acres to in-stream use. They've not been using the water right. For those 60 acres, they've been leasing it once every 5 years for the last 10 years in order to avoid forfeiture and retain their validity. But the landowner would like to cease irrigating on the acres altogether, and so they would like to permanently transfer that in-stream. Because Mill Creek is not currently regulated for in-stream uses by Water Resources without an official in-stream transfer, the water that's associated with this transaction would be diverted by other irrigators. So transferring the water right in stream will ensure that stream flow is present as long as there's natural flow in the creek. Water Resources Department currently regulates for out-of-stream uses here, but co-regulating for in-stream uses puts out-of-stream uses and in-stream uses on equal footing with other senior water rights of the same priority date. And then finally, to speak a little bit about the reliability of the water, the water rights involved in the transaction are senior water rights, but they need to be shared proportionally with other senior water rights. And Bruce, this is where, as you mentioned, it gets very confusing, all this water stuff, right? So the need to share that proportionally with other senior water right holders could potentially reduce the water transferred in stream below that 0.66 that they're proposing. The application states that water rights have been curtailed in the past in early July, but they've never been entirely regulated off the system. And so the review team noted that they felt this is a cost-effective project. It provides the first permanently protected in-stream flow to Mill Creek. So while the in-stream benefits to target species there may be more to learn about what that would be, they felt that the monitoring and coordination with Water Resources staff that are expected by now having an in-stream use for them to regulate is expected to have a positive impact on the creek beyond the specific water right and water amount itself. They also felt like this could be the spark for other transactions and in-stream transactions in this creek. So because the review team recommended to fund, or because of this value that they see, the review team recommended to fund it with the conditions that we've already taken a peek at, but that are in the evaluation that is in attachment A to the staff report. We have there's the one other project, but are there specific questions on
Jason?
For the record, Jason Robinson. So as I look at these, I mean, we have opportunities and benefits. Opportunities being there's rights available for purchase to put water in stream, but then I look at the benefits. And this one here, for me, is I'm really having a hard time describing the true benefits, and there's a lot of uncertainties and complications with this one. Is there more information on the actual in-stream benefits that you can provide that would support maybe a better rationale for why this is more of, I look at this as more of an opportunity type acquisition than a benefit acquisition, so.
Jillian McCarthy for the record. So I think that the Deschutes River Conservancy was very clear in that the anticipated benefits or estimated benefits are a bit unclear from this, and what they really stressed, because it's not a large amount of water, so it's not going to keep water in stream, throughout the year. But they said they anticipate it will extend the period that the creek is connected. What they really highlighted in this, and what the review team also stressed, what the Technical Advisory Committee stressed, is that this type of project in an area where there has not been a permanent transaction before, permanent transfer before, it can really change the water management and perception of water management in an area, and can lead to future transactions that are more meaningful, have more meaningful in-stream benefits. And I wrote down, actually, because I was checking in with Casey on this, and that they felt very strongly on this, and I thought that I would share with you what she had written to me, which is that this project it was quite compelling. This project is the tinder flintstone spark for restoration change in Mill Creek, and that's a huge part of its value.
Eric.
Eric Murray for the record. I agree this sounds pretty complicated, and it sounded like maybe part of this was there's maybe some contradiction in maybe what you're saying. So assuming that it's probably at least somewhat, the system is probably somewhat over appropriated, it sounds like at the low flow period there would be a benefit to habitat in improving the amount of water, but likely from the current point or points of diversion down to the next eligible user. There would be a benefit there, but unlikely to be a benefit past that point during is that about what's happening?
That is Jillian McCarthy for the record, that's my understanding, yes, as with all of our in-stream transactions that we do, that there is anticipated to be a benefit. The extent of the benefit and assuredness of the benefit is the piece that's unclear, as often is with all of our water transactions.
And for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I think the one distinction I would add is, and I don't know, as most people don't, exactly, is there an 1896 and then a 1912 and then a 1954 and then a 1906, right? But it may not just be to the next point of diversion, it's going to be to the next point of senior diversion, right? And so you might get past 3 other points of junior diversion before it gets taken out again. So there's a little bit more benefit because it's senior to get it a little further down the system until you hit the next senior right. Now, if the next senior right is next, you only get to the next point of diversion, but you could actually get past that depending on where they sit in location on the system. Yes, and that's what this project is.
Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie McCloud-Skinner. And in concept, I think these are great opportunities, but specific to this, it sounds like you addressed this before, is we would not be paying for paper water. It would be wet water, right? So that would be, okay. Then is DRC going to be monitoring this? Because just having, living in rural areas, you walk through areas where you see a creek with a pipe sticking out of it randomly. So I would assume that there's still going to be some monitoring if this investment's made.
Jillian McCarthy for the record, yes, and there is monitoring that's associated with all of these, and we also put reporting conditions in our grant agreements to have that annual monitoring to make sure that the water has been in stream.
And great, and I assume that would be timely based on when the water would be flowing in terms of the timing of the monitoring, just an assumption.
Yes.
And then lastly, this is actually, again, I think I'm not standing in the way of it all, but I do know that there's some unique issues around public lands going to Crook County and some unique levels of conflict. And so if whether the stream crosses private or public land, there's been a case in Crook County where the county assumes a level of ownership over public resources that is kind of unique somewhat to the state. And so are there specific issues here that I assume the team has looked through and looked at the potential for conflicts with either junior water rights holders or also some issues even with the regional government agencies?
Jillian McCarthy, for the record. That's a very complicated question. And my response is that did not come up that was not something discussed in the application. It did not come up in the technical advisory committee meeting. And so I am uncertain myself, but my assumption would be if they thought that would be an issue, that it would have been raised as a point through the advisory committee.
Go ahead, proceed, Jillian.
Thank you. Okay, so the next project is 2209901, and this is the 15-mile action to stabilize temperatures, or the FAST program. You have seen this before, you have funded this before. This is a continuation of a voluntary incentive-based program to provide payments to irrigators who reduce their water use when temperature alerts are issued, and this is to avoid lethal stream temps in 15 Mile Creek. The proposal was submitted by the Wasco Soil and Water Conservation District. They're requesting $110,000. 15 Mile Creek, as most of you are aware, is characterized by low flows and high stream temperatures during the summer. There's over-allocation of water rights to irrigators, which just exacerbates the issue. The FAST program was first conceived in 2009 after there was a fish kill of Mid-Columbia steelhead in the creek. So this was really intended to be a short-term, quick emergency solution that would benefit fish and other aquatic organisms to temporarily increase the flows during hot periods in order to reduce those temperatures. They issue a stream temperature alert. This is how the program works. They issue a stream temperature alert when modeled, ODFW modeled temperature predictions predict potentially lethal stream temperatures. So the FAST program issues an alert to irrigators. Irrigators who curtail their water use during those are compensated. And then the SWCD also monitors stream flow and temperature and provides us an annual report to document that stream flow response. So in this application, Wasco SWCD is requesting funds for a FAST program coordinator position and also for incentive payments to irrigators for up to 1,000 acres. They did provide estimates from 2018 that the FAST program averaged 5.15 CFS in stream through their calls and alerts. The review team noted that the FAST program is expected to continue to be a very effective tool to avoid those lethal in-stream temperatures in the creek. And what they stressed is that short-term solutions like this are critical, but the program has not necessarily evolved from where it first started. And so they would like to see the program transition to more strategic targeting of irrigators with the most reliable, most senior water rights to make sure that they are paying for very reliable water in stream through those incentive payments. And they also they also discussed, as you mentioned, Liza Jane, longer-term mechanisms that could protect, that could result in legally protected in-stream flow. So this is a voluntary program. They are not committing to anything besides reducing use during an alert. And the way it's set up in there's a couple of different options where they can sign up beforehand, before the season, and commit to reducing use for every alert, or it can be alert by alert. They can decide on the fly whether they are able to reduce their use or not. And so payments are structured according to those two options. Again, you can see this was recommended for funding by the review team. There are conditions in there that are outlined in the evaluation in attachment A. And so I will take any questions that you all have on this project.
Alan?
Alan Henn for the record. What's the duration of our purchase here?
This is for, that should be an easy question. I believe that this is for 2 irrigation seasons. I believe that's for 2 irrigation seasons, and I can check very quickly and confirm that for you.
Barbara?
So, sorry, if I understand this correctly, this is for funding a position?
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, there's two primary components of the budget. One is funding a coordinator position to work with the irrigators, to issue alerts, to work with the model. And the other major component is the incentive payments to landowners for up to that 1,000 acres enrolled.
So follow-up, have we ever funded a position before under this acquisition program?
This is the first time that we have funded a full position. There have been funds that have gone towards staff time, but this is the first time they've actually they've had someone working on this program, but this is the first time that they've actually designated a position for it. But it has grown to a point where they feel they need the position in order to continue the program to be functional.
One more question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there another grant program that this proposal would fall under?
For the record, Jillian McCarthy. Go ahead. And I'm going to go ahead. We've talked a number of times about what this program can cover. And so in 2013, the last time the rules were revised, they were, I don't know what they looked like before that. Maybe they were created in 13. It's a bit before my time. Created in 13. Okay. And so at that point, the funds could be used to fund the actual transactions and to fund programs that would lead to in-stream transactions or protected in-stream use. And Maida is going to jump in.
I just, for the record, I'm not going to jump in and solve it, but this is one of the interesting things around, at the point in time when we did the rules in 2013, some of our partners, including DRC, proposed that every irrigation piping project should be in the water acquisition program because you're putting water back in stream. And so there is this funky space where permanent transfers, in-stream leases absolutely fit the water acquisitions program. We have determined that piping projects are restoration grants. They're not going to be here. But we've gone through, especially on this one, a pretty extensive analysis and decided that really its best fit is here, even though it's not a permanent or in-stream. And that's why that program's leading to in-stream water fits here. And I think we've continued that in the proposed rules moving forward. But this is one of those funky spaces, but so we have made an explicit determination to place these types of programs here.
For the record, Eric Williams, the Rulemaking Advisory Committee actually talked about this quite a bit in the sense that, yes, having permanent water in stream is a great goal to have. However, there are several barriers to that for a lot of landowners around the state, a lot of very good reasons they may not want to participate in that. And so a good chunk of the effort from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee was spent talking about other mechanisms that are sort of outside of the OWRD regulatory process, the permanent and in-stream transfers and leases, but rather focused on more responsive type of programs such as this one. And a lot of the focus was on how do you verify the benefit of those programs. And so when you take a look at the rules that are planned to go out for public comment next month, you'll see a lot of requirements in there that are on the verification end of things. How do we know we're going to get the benefits that we want to see? What kind of in-stream monitoring is going to happen to show the validity of the benefit, the in-stream benefit that's proposed? Because another piece of this that we alluded to before, even with permanent transfers, at the proposal stage, you're making your best estimate of what you're going to get, and then you go through this verification process. That same issue really holds for transactions that really aren't permanent in-stream transfers or leases. You still have to do that verification phase if we're doing something like the FAST program. How are we measuring the benefit in-stream? And so I think we'll be talking a bit more about that when we get to the rules in April.
Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, I did want to note I think there was a piece in your question that I don't know that we spoke to, and maybe this isn't what you were asking. But to be clear, so we are proposing or they are proposing to pay for staff here, and we do that in our restoration and other grants as well. So it isn't, if it moved over to a different program, they could still propose the same components, and that would be a cost that we would cover there as well.
And for the record, Eric Williams, and it's likely, I think, that we will see staff costs in those non-regulatory types of proposals that come in, because you need to have expertise and field work that's going to do that verification phase, and that's human resource time that we'll likely see in project application budgets.
Bruce.
I understand the allure of this particular kind of program. But I'm really uncomfortable with how we can monitor. When I read that the evidence is no observed instances of steelhead mortality in the creek since it was enacted in 2013. I don't know if there was steelhead mortality in other creeks, or I just, that seemed less evidentiary than I was comfortable with. If we funded it before, what have we seen other than the no steelhead mortality that makes staff saying this is something we should fund again?
I think there are two pieces, Jillian, I'm going to ask you to respond to, because there's the steelhead mortality, there's also the temperature tracking that ODF&W does, so you can actually see that when they had predicted exceedance, they didn't hit it. And then this is one of the reasons this works here and doesn't work in other places is it is an intensively managed system. So they actually can see that things are being turned off and on. Whereas to Jamie's point earlier, in some other systems, you see a random pipe in the creek. So I think the mortality is one indicator, and we are impressed with that. But there are some specific things that, because this is about the water use itself, that they mandate in terms of actually tracking that the stuff got turned off. So we are paying for that temperature decrease. That is...
I didn't see a temperature decrease.
Or sorry, the lack of temperature increase. We are paying to not hit the lethal temperature by putting more water in stream. And they do have good tracking mechanisms.
There is evidence of that.
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, yes, there is evidence of that.
Okay.
And they have extensive monitoring and real-time data available for both stream flow and for temperature.
It works.
Works.
Okay, Randy Labby for the record. Jillian, have you completed your presentation accepting the question from Alan?
Yes. Just to note that this is the table here of the staff recommended funding for the projects.
Do you have what you need?
Yeah, this is Alan. If in fact it's a 2-year project, I think the challenge I have with this, and this is a creative way in which to help at critical times for acute issues, but in 2 years or 3 years, would we see this project coming back to us requesting another $110,000 or $150,000? And my question is, what are we buying in the long run for this, except for a very acute time in which you can help save or provide a steady, cool water for that particular reach? It's a tough one. I think, as a board, we just have to take a good hard look at this and see if we want long-term or acute short-term. If we could see that this acute short-term approach had some return for us, I feel much more comfortable in support of these projects. I know this program is fairly young and it is working, but in the long run, I just have to question whether or not that's where we want to go.
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, that's the exact conversation that the Technical Advisory Committee had, and that's why you see some of the conditions that you do under the funding recommendation. They feel like this is really critical, but having not seen the program progress or evolve from what it started out as originally, to either target more reliable water rights or to transition to something that is more permanent or longer term. They had the same thing, and they felt they had the same concerns. NIFWF has been co-funding this for a number of years as well, and as a funder, they had the exact same conversation, and I think it is one that you should discuss and consider.
Okay, I think we're ready. Jamie?
Thank you, Chair. Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I think for the rules that are in place, I think staff did a great job, and I'm confident with the recommendation that's been made. But based on some of the comments that have come up, this is why I originally brought up this idea of having a bigger picture policy discussion. So not the how do we do that piece that's really that staff driven, but the parts of this watershed that I'm familiar with, they are heavily managed, as Maida said, and also know that some of the landowners are working on buffer areas with vegetation to maintain the water quality and also temperature. But this gets then to Alan's point of, from a policy perspective, the board may want to say, okay, when we have this type of situation come up, we might do a one or two interim process funding this type of project, but really what we want to do, the partnership to come back to us with is say, hey, why don't we look at corridors and vegetation and planting? Because I think that would potentially be the longer term solution in the areas of this watershed that I'm personally familiar with, and I've driven some of these roads. But I think that's that bigger picture thinking that I see as a board level and a policy level discussion. So I just go back to my earlier point that I do think there's some kind of higher level discussions that we need to think through the long term in terms of the overall bang for our buck. But I think with the projects before us, again, I think I'm very comfortable with staff's proposed, and I think, given the rules that are in place, I think y'all did a great job on these projects.
Thank you, Jamie. I think we're ready for an up or down point. I think the sense of the board on this, the reservations that have been expressed, can be reflected back to the staff.
All right, Jason Robinson for the record. Then I move the board award funding for water acquisition grants as specified in Table 1 on the staff report, and I want to add a contingency to that since we have 2020-9901 is a multi-season. I'd like to add a contingency that we have some sort of a mid-season check-in on that specific program back to the board just on how that position's coming along, how that program worked in the first season.
Second to that, motion by Jason.
Discussion. Did we include with the conditions as identified in that motion? Because there are conditions tied to that.
So this would be an additional condition.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this would be an additional condition on that. Yeah.
Is there a second to Jason's motion? Jamie? All in favor? More discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
It's Liza Jane for the record. Is it possible to split this up, or is it an all or nothing vote?
It is an all or nothing vote.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. You can make another motion.
For the record, you could amend and split it into a proposal for each project separately.
Is there discussion about that possibility?
Yeah, you can make an alternate motion.
Only if it's
So
up for discussion.
if you could have the discussion, and if you decide to go that route, as Jamie said, I can tell you how to walk through the process. So if you guys want to go down the path that Liza Jean just recommended of splitting it into two votes.
Why do you want to do that?
Why do I want to do that? This is Liza Jane for the record. I'm not comfortable with the first one, Mill Creek water rights. I guess it's because it sounds like I have a picture that this water right that we're looking at hasn't really been using the water right, and then they can sell that, but it's going to get used downstream anyway. So are those, I guess, Is there measurement devices on those diversions? Is it, I'm not confident. I'm not confident with the information I have. So my motion would be not to fund that one and to fund the 9901. But if if that isn't an overall concern or I don't have enough information.
Yeah, let's act on the motion, and then if it goes down, we'll reconnect.
Okay.
Jamie McLeod, it's a timeliness question. So you mentioned that the owner of that water right has been leasing it every 5 years. When's the last time they did that?
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, in 2019.
So if we were to essentially bump this conversation and the water right owner were agreeable, we could potentially revisit this specific project because they were still within their 5 years. They wouldn't be losing their water right.
For the record, Jillian McCarthy, yes, that is correct. I guess I would add to that, though, that it's the water currently, if we were not to fund this now and they were not using their water, that water would be available for downstream, continue to be available for downstream users. If we fund the transaction and then, or if they complete the transaction, however they do, then that water will be designated it will be a protected in-stream use, and Water Resources will be managing it and making sure, verifying that water is in stream while there is water in stream. And so there is a distinct difference between the amount of water that would be in stream if they do not do the transfer versus if they do. So in terms of that water will be used by other users if there's no one there to make sure that water is in stream.
Okay.
I have one more question. So I'm following up on that. This is Liza Jane. So then does this decision impact all the downstream users? Because they've been using it all along, and we fund this, and now it's they're watching. So are all those folks going to lose water they think they have because of this upstream decision?
So for the record, Jillian McCarthy, this is where Casey would be incredibly helpful to be sitting next to me and respond. I don't know the number of downstream users that there are off the top of my head. What I would say, my response would be that that's water that this transaction would be a legal transaction, and that the water that they have been using, yes, they would no longer be able necessarily to use that. They may get regulated off earlier. And so, yeah. So, yes.
And Maida Lofsgarden, that would apply to the water users that are junior to this, right? So,
correct.
So the water, if you think about it, that water would have been used on the farm, right? It's not being used on the farm right now because they're just leasing it every 5 years, so it's going down, and then a junior water user could pick it up because there's more water. This would not allow a junior water user to pick up that water, making it available for the fish in stream. So it does change, but it's water that had they been irrigating, it would have never gotten to those downstream users.
And for the record, Eric Williams, the technical reviewers also were fairly confident in the proposed monitoring approach for that, and that the folks that are doing the monitoring have a clear communication mechanism with Water Resources to make sure that connection happens, and so that regulation would occur to indeed keep that water in stream, preventing a junior user from taking it out of stream.
Okay, in the absence of a, what? Go ahead.
Real quick, just because we have that conversation, I'm going to amend that motion, and we will take them as separate items, with that contingency still being built into 2020-901.
So, and then if there's a second, I can explain what your process would be. No, he is amending
I'm
his
amending the
motion.
motion to deal with those on a case-by-case basis. Okay.
So what you will be doing now, the motion as amended, is that you are voting on 2209901 with the condition that Jason outlined. You will then, you actually have to take two votes because it's an amendment. So you're going to vote on it as amended, and then you'll vote, or the amendment, and then the original motion as amended, and then you'll have a new motion for the first. There is a second.
Okay. There being no further uprising, we'd like to.
And I should remind you of your voting, this is a funding decision, so more than 2 no votes is a not approval. So we may have hand raises or something.
Okay, we'll vote first for the 2209901 motion by Jason, seconded by Jamie as amended. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. Now we'll vote singly on 2209901.
Now you
I'm
have
sorry,
you have one more vote on the motion as amended. It's just a technical
Okay.
process. So you're going to basically vote again on that motion, and then we'll jump
Yep.
to the other one.
All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
And now we need a new motion for 9,900. I just did receive information that might be helpful in the conversation, that the priority date for the Mill Creek is 1868. So it is it's old.
So
So I will make a new motion then that the board award funding for the acquisition grant 220-9900 as presented in the table 1 of the staff report.
And Jamie seconds that. Any further question? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nope.
One no, is there another no?
There's
2
no.
no's.
So
Okay,
if you're at 2, then it passes.
yeah.
More than 2 is.
Okay, thank you. We'll now take a 15-minute break and come back at 10:35.
If I could note one thing, I just want to make sure I got clear what our next steps are. So one is we will do a conference call because it does sound like there's more interest than just Jamie to begin that conversation about the policy level. We are in a good state. I mentioned that we're super tight because we have these new rules coming out, but the rules are not final and you'll be voting on them in April. So we can have a conversation on that call about going through the new rules and seeing if they satisfy your policy questions, and if they don't, then we're in that space. We just need to do that conversation sooner than later because we're in that space. So that's one. Number 2, a presentation on historical water applications, their success, what we've received or achieved through those prior acquisitions. I also think it's worthwhile at the same time to just revisit the conversation about valuation because it is interesting to go from a $46,000 to a $2.1 million acquisition. And then a mid-season post-year 1 check-in on 15 Mile. Okay. Sorry.
Okay, we're adjourned for 15 minutes.
All right. Let's get back to work here. Okay, we're going to be moving on to agenda item R, FIP program monitoring. And we've got Renee and a whole cast of characters here. So I'll turn it over to Renee.
Good morning, co-chairs, members of the board. For the record, Renee Davis, Deputy Director. It takes a village to do FIP monitoring and progress tracking, obviously. So I'm joined today by several OWEB staff who I will let introduce themselves. I do want to note that Lauren Mork from the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council is with us. Lauren is a program manager at the Watershed Council, but she's also been part of the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, or BEF team, that's been working with us since 2016 on FIP monitoring and progress tracking. So Robert Warren, who some of you may remember from past presentations from BEF, since it's rare, he's not able to be here due to some family issues, but we will be well taken care of in Lauren's hands as we're walking through this staff report. So we are on agenda item R for the record. Let's see. So you will see if you leafed through the staff report, we have a lot of products to share with you, and we'll give you a sense of how we got to these pieces. We have multiple people presenting, so we would ask that you keep questions to clarifying questions. We have protected a good chunk of time at the end of this presentation for a full discussion. So if you could keep it to clarifying questions, it'll help us stay on track. So quick grounding, one of the key premises of the Focused Investment Partnership Program is that longer term and larger scale investment will in fact hopefully result in bigger bang for the buck in terms of ecological return on investment. So rather than a project by project approach with less predictability, that a more coordinated strategic investment hopefully will get us farther down the road in seeing some of the shifts in ecological process and function that we have been hoping to. So since 2016, we have been working with BEF to structure a progress monitoring framework for the FIP program. And that really has been a combination of two things. So one, helping us to make sure that as a funder, we're thinking about what are those pieces that we should be tracking at the program level to help inform adaptive management of the program, but also what are some of the tools that we can put in place to help our FIP partners be able to successfully monitor and track and report out on the progress that they're seeing, both on implementation outputs, but more importantly, I think on ecological outcomes. So these are the three products that we'll be talking through with you today. I'll run through these and then we'll do a quick orientation to the staff report. So the first is the generic ecological priority theories of change. Leah will be walking you through those shortly. And then we'll move to the progress monitoring frameworks. These items, which are included in attachment C, are for the 5 newest implementation FIPs, so the cohort that was selected by you all a year ago. And then we'll move to the progress tracking reports. These are 6 reports focused on the first cohort of FIPs that you guys awarded back in January of 2016. So let's actually take a quick look at the staff report because I want to make sure you're oriented now rather than being confused as we move through presenters and wondering what am I supposed to be looking at. So attachment A, I'll walk through briefly in just a few minutes. It's just really an orientation of how the different products fit together. If you flip to attachment B, this is where you'll see the generic ecological priority theories of change. You did see one of these at the October board meeting, the one focused on sagebrush, sage-grouse habitat. So we'll walk through the finalized documents for all 7 of the FIP ecological priorities. Sorry, yeah, Leah will walk you through those. And then we'll move to attachment C, which Lauren and I will walk you through. These are the progress monitoring frameworks for the 5 newest implementation FIPs. There are multiple pages to each one, so we will not be able to walk you through all of the content for all 5 of those, but just wanted to give you a sense that as Lauren's talking through, you'll be flipping through the pages likely of the Baker sage-grouse example. And then going to attachment D, these are the progress tracking reports for the first 6 implementation FIPs, covering their progress in the first biennium of funding, and Lisa and Andrew and Eric Hartstein will walk you through those. So really this package of products is intended for a couple things. One is to make sure that we can communicate out the progress that we're seeing associated with the Focused Investment Partnership investments, not only to you as board members, but also in coordination with our FIP partners and to the interested public. Finally, you'll see some of the tools, for example, with the progress monitoring frameworks, really helping to provide a logic-based foundation for tracking progress and understanding what are those outcomes we would expect to see, but also helping to give the partnership some tools for adaptive management through time, given that these are longer-term investments that cover a whole slew of different types of projects. So if you take a look at attachment A in your staff report, this is really how these various pieces fit together. So if you look at the x-axis of this little schematic, it's taking you through time. So from program development to when we have active implementation FIPs underway to post-implementation. If you look at the y-axis, you'll be seeing that we go from more general to more specific. So down in the bottom left corner, the ecological priority theories of change that Leah will walk you through, those really are intended to help provide at a high level, at the ecological priority level, what will we expect as we walk from actions all the way through to near-term and then longer-term ecological outcomes. So they're not intended to say specifically what's happening under the Willamette, the upper Willamette FIP. It's really at that ecological priority level. As you start to move up to the upper right of the schematic, you start to get into some of the more specific individual FIP-specific information. So the progress monitoring frameworks that Lauren will walk you through are focused very much at that individual FIP scale, really considering what their operational context is and the actions that they've proposed. And then as we move to the progress tracking reports, again, even more specificity because we're looking at a particular time frame and what a FIP has done in a 2-year period and what are they seeing by way of early implementation outputs, but also starting to see some of those ecological outcomes based on some of the monitoring work that they're doing. Oh, one quick piece, Liza Jane, in response to your question yesterday about with the partnership TA, if we're paying people to sit around at meetings, is that really giving us more on the ground? So I don't have a concrete answer, but I do want to flag that that is part of what we hope to see out of this package of FIP monitoring and tracking products is really a better understanding of, given that, you know, we have maybe invested in some of these folks as development FIPs, we've funded partnership capacity as in their implementation FIP investments. We're paying them for that coordination, that kind of deeper dive into monitoring. We're really hoping that these products start to give us a handle on what is that difference that we're seeing. Are we seeing an added benefit? And are we seeing that bigger kind of ecological return on our funding investment? So with that, I'll turn it over to Leah.
Thank you. Leah Tai, Partnerships Coordinator for the record. And so I'm just going to briefly walk you all through the ecological priority theory of change diagrams. Attachment B, as Renee mentioned, these really nice 11 by 17s that are folded up in your staff report. There's one of these diagrams for each of the 7 focused investment priorities. And these illustrate the connections between strategies, outcomes, outputs and outcomes when we're addressing limiting factors for each of these priorities that the board has identified. These diagrams are really intended, as Renee mentioned, for a high-level overview of the priority, and they're really helpful for new and emerging partnerships or people that are trying to understand the FIP program and understand what that holistic view that OWEB is looking at means. And so I'm excited to be able to share these with partnerships that have already reached out and are thinking about future applications or kind of asking questions about the FIP program and want to know what does it mean to be a focused investment partnership? What are the types of actions and outcomes that OWEB is looking to see in these different priority areas? These are very generic, so they're guidance at a high level. They're meant for broad understanding, and they're very simplified. So you'll see a much more detailed results chain for each of the individual partnerships, but this is just at a large scaled lens, and we'll make them available on our website, and we're also going to share them during informational webinars and other outreach methods when we're talking to potential applicants and just trying to share more information about the FIP program. And so I think actually I'll just leave it at that. There is one of these for each of the 7 FIP priorities, and you guys can spend some time looking over them and seeing kind of the final products. They look really nice. And if you have any clarifying questions or questions about specific priorities, feel free.
So any questions for Leah before we move to the next products?
Questions? I have a comment. It's hard to believe that this is Leah's first meeting. She just got right on.
I agree.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll move now to attachment C, the progress monitoring frameworks. Again, this is encompassing the 5 implementation FIPS in the second cohort that were funded just about a year ago exactly. So I popped out the first one, Baker, Sage, Grouse. We'll do a little orientation and then I'll turn it over to Leah. But first, for those who have been on the board for a while, so Alan, Debbie, let's see, Randy will remember this. When we first embarked on this process with BEF, we were really interested in having a balance of kind of 2 issues. One, making sure that we have a consistent and practical framework that's scientifically based, but giving you all as a board the ability to really understand what do we expect to see out of these FIPS and how can we have some commonality in how they're reported. The challenge with that, though, and this is the striking of the balance, is what happens in the Upper Deschutes FIP, focused on native fish habitat, is quite different than what's happening in the Ashland dry-type forest FIP, is quite different than what may be happening over in Harney Wetlands. So making sure that we have this common framework that is sufficiently robust to account for those differences across FIPs. And so Lauren will go into some of the details of how we got to these progress monitoring frameworks that really we think at a more detailed individual FIP level helps to provide that strong scientific foundation, but also help us to know what should we be thinking about in terms of monitoring parameters, how to track this work through time, and also the need for adaptive management so we can say, we expected to be moving towards this outcome, we're not quite getting there. What might we have missed in planning our implementation approach, or what might we need to refine? So you did see the progress monitoring frameworks for the first set of FIPS back in October of 2017. As I walk through the attachment, some things will be familiar. So they start with an overview of each partnership, including that operational context that I mentioned. We then move into a theory of change for each of the individual partnerships. And then we go to the infamous results chain, Alan's wiring diagram, that really shows you all of that interconnectedness between actions and potential outcomes that we would see through time. And then ultimately, we move to these crosswalk tables that cover both implementation progress, so more of the kind of typical restoration outputs that you might see, some of those statistics about acres treated or miles of habitat opened, but also a crosswalk table for ecological progress, which becomes really critical as we're thinking about how to monitor all of this work to really be able to capture progress. So I think with that, Lauren, I'll turn it over to you to walk them through the specifics.
Great. Thanks, Renee.
Yep.
And thank you, Lisa. That works. So the progress monitoring framework consists of these 2 main elements, the results chain and the crosswalk matrix. And so the results chain is a graphical representation or model of each partnership's theory for how their strategies, their restoration strategies, are expected to produce those long-term ecological impacts. And then the crosswalk matrix details the key objectives of the partnership related both to the implementation and to the ecological outcomes, along with associated metrics to measure progress toward meeting those key objectives. And we've seen that FIPS have started incorporating this progress monitoring framework into planning and allocating funds. Many are actively referencing their results chain in both initiative and project planning discussions, and some have gone as far as to require in their applications for funding a discussion of the connection between an individual project and the results chain for the benefit of all of the partners, as well as for the technical review team. So, as Renee mentioned, Bonneville Environmental Foundation piloted this progress monitoring framework with the initial cohort of implementation FIPS in 2017. And in 2019, the BEF team engaged the new FIPS
that Renee referenced, awarded in July, to collaboratively construct and vet their unique progress monitoring frameworks for each of those new FIPs. And so what did that process look like? The Bonneville Environmental Foundation team reviewed the strategic action plans and monitoring detailed in those FIP applications, and from that review developed preliminary draft results chains, which we then presented to those FIPs, to the 5 new FIPs. And we recruited a working group from each FIP. And so during a 3-hour work session, that working group had an opportunity to agree upon and discuss the theory of change and results chain and to propose edits and revisions. During those work sessions, they also identified and refined the key outputs and outcomes that they would include for monitoring. And those key outputs and outcomes then formed the basis of that crosswalk matrix, which we'll dive into deeper in a moment. We incorporated those revisions and edits into the results chain, constructed the crosswalk matrix for each FIP, and presented those final progress monitoring frameworks to the FIPs for approval. Beyond that process of developing the progress monitoring framework, the results chains provide a basis for discussion of monitoring gaps and needs, and addressing those knowledge gaps allows FIPs to strengthen their ability to articulate a more holistic and accurate narrative about the progress they're achieving through their restoration work. Also worth mentioning that OWEB has received a lot of positive feedback from FIPs who are appreciative of the support they're receiving for the results chain and PMF development process, and are excited to use this tool through the duration of their FIP for planning and for adaptive management. Okay, so the wiring diagram. And you guys have one of these. You can use the bigger sage grouse, or you can use any of the other new FIPs. So the results chain is really, it's the foundation at the center of this progress monitoring framework. As I mentioned, it's that graphical representation of the theory of change for how each partnership hypothesizes their restoration strategies, so those yellow hexagons on the left, will ultimately result in their desired ecological outcomes, which are the green ovals on the far right. So the results chain identifies the immediate results, or the outputs, which are represented as blue rectangles, that are expected following implementation of restoration strategies. It also identifies the near and long-term ecological outcomes. Those are represented as the lavender rectangles, which are expected to occur in response to those implementation outputs. And it also illustrates, using arrows, the hypothesized relationships between the predicted results of strategy implementation and those ecological outcomes. And so this approach and the process of articulating and agreeing on what those hypothesized relationships are, this allows partners to examine the underlying assumptions and logic behind their restoration strategies. And it provides an opportunity to identify and prioritize the key uncertainties about the ecological responses expected to occur following strategy implementation. It's important to note here that the results chain, for all its complexity, is still inevitably a simplification of the ecological context. There's always a need to balance an appropriate level of detail with the utility of what you can see on that page. The law of diminishing returns does apply, and more boxes and arrows do not necessarily equate to a better understanding of the system. The results chain also suggests simple unidirectional relationships, and we know that's not how the real world functions. For all of these reasons, the results chain is a tool and should be considered such rather than a representation of reality. And so the crosswalk matrix then takes those key implementation results and ecological outcomes that the partnership identified for monitoring. And you can see that these are indexed on the results chain with numbers. So some of those blue implementation results boxes and lavender ecological outcomes boxes in the results chain have numbers attached to them. And those are then taken and put in the crosswalk matrix. And for each of those, objectives and metrics are associated with the implementation results and ecological outcomes. So implementation results or outputs objectives are usually really clearly defined in a FIPS strategic action plan. This might be something like treat 50 acres of invasive weeds. And the metrics are usually fairly straightforward as well. For ecological outcomes, the specific objectives are more difficult to clearly define because ecological outcomes often depend in magnitude and degree on environmental factors. So for example, a high flow event might play a really important role in determining the magnitude of the response to a stream restoration project, or a drought year might really determine the outcome of treating those 50 acres of invasive weeds. And so what we've encouraged FIPS to use for objectives are trajectories, so a reduction in cover of invasive weeds, or using ranges of values rather than specific values for those ecological outcome objectives. So what are the benefits to a partnership of developing a progress monitoring framework? One of the benefits OWEB and the BEF team have observed is that opportunity to establish agreement around the understanding of the underlying assumptions in science and how those align with the overarching goals of the initiative. This process of going through the results chain together, sitting in a room very much like this, in a format very much like this, and discussing and agreeing on how their theories of change will lead to those outcomes helps further define and focus the work of the initiative. As the name suggests, the Progress Monitoring Framework does provide a framework for monitoring and also for adaptive management. It does this by planning upfront for monitoring progress and also informs supplemental monitoring needs. And the Progress Monitoring Framework, and in particular the results chain, also helps prioritize and validate those projects among partners, as well as identify those knowledge gaps, uncertainties, and strategic points of intervention. So with that, I will hand it back to Renee for some lessons learned.
For the record, Renee Davis, and Courtney is helping us time keep, so she's not writing notes about progress monitoring frameworks. So a few lessons learned specific to OWEB staff as part of this process and working now with 2 cohorts of FIPS and BEF is timing is really key. With the first cohort, we absolutely were playing catch up in going through the process to develop the progress monitoring frameworks. Many of them had already launched into not only restoration, but monitoring work, and so having the ability to do this much sooner in the process that we've been able to bless to have be the case with the second cohort can really help much earlier on to inform that assessment of any potential gaps in monitoring, and also I think just help provide some of that benefit that Lauren was describing about shared understanding of what some of those underlying assumptions were that maybe the partnership was making that can even course correct some of their restoration planning. The second is communicating early and often about how we as a funder expect that the partnerships use this. If it initially felt like, is this something that you're going to be judging us on? Will you be forcing us to say something in our applications about this? And really, no, that's not the case. What we wanted to make sure is that there was a very strong logic foundation for the work that was being laid out, that we did have a deliberate process to really take a hard look at the monitoring and determine, does it mesh with the types of outputs and outcomes that we intend to track, to not be directive, but to hopefully be supportive and helpful with tools like this. So in terms of next steps, we now have the finished products for the second cohort that you just saw in attachment C. We'll be walking through that with each of the 5 FIP partnerships during conference calls over the next couple weeks, I think it is. And so what we'll be talking through with them is exactly that question of data gaps. We now have the crosswalk tables. We understand where some of the opportunities might be for monitoring. Let's take a look at what you have planned in terms of monitoring and determine, is there a need for some supplemental monitoring funding to help fill any gaps that were identified. So given that we didn't have the benefit of the PMFs when the FIPs were launching, the board has set aside a bit of potential supplemental monitoring funding for the second cohort again. So having that conversation with them. The third cohort of FIPs that will be coming in will already have done this work as part of the strategic action planning process. We built this into the guidance for the SAP development, so we will no longer be playing catch up. It will be a very different conversation with the next cohort of FIPs, which is fantastic. Andrew presented in October to you about the adaptive management guidance document that BEF has developed as part of this work. So again, a helpful tool as they're thinking not only about monitoring, but then what does it look like to actively engage in adaptive management? What do some of those processes and pauses look like? And then finally, BEF's work this biennium with us will be developing a monitoring plan template for those partnerships that are interested in beginning to string all of this together. Maybe getting to a question I think maybe Alan asked of the Winter Lake folks. What's the strategic action plan? What's your game plan on monitoring? Helping to provide some tools for folks to use. So with that, I'll pause, see if you have any clarifying questions, because I know we're tight on time before we go to progress tracking reports.
Questions? Okay, looks good.
Okay. I'll turn it over to Lisa and Andrew and Eric.
For the record, Lisa Apple, Conservation Outcomes Specialist. And we'll be going through the progress tracking reports. So you're going to need to look at attachment D, or of item R. And we'll be walking through the content and looking at the different categories of information contained within the progress tracking reports. So these are a tool to communicate the progress and the evolution of each of the first 6 implementation FIPs as they proceed through implementing the strategic action plan, monitoring their outcomes, and adaptively managing their FIP. They are a short, concise summary, 4 pages in length, and information is prioritized and written to fit within the limited space. And this tracking progress is designed to be aligned with OWEB's grant making and reporting cycles, and it's done per biennium. So the progress tracking report development process took 1 year. So it was a deliberate and thoughtful process, and now that we have a template and framework developed, it will be a faster process in the future. And it was absolutely a team effort to develop these reports. So Renee Davis played a strong role in leading the overall look and feel and content. Gretchen Kirchner, a technical support specialist, did the graphic design. And Andrew and Eric Hartstein played a strong role in advising on content and partnering with the FIPs to bring their content forth in an accurate and engaging manner. So there is robust involvement of each FIP to shape the content, and their feedback was incorporated in all of the reports. So in regards to the development process over the 1 year time, staff kicked off the project with an explanatory meeting with each FIP, and this ranged from a direct face-to-face meeting or targeted phone calls to introduce them to the concept and let them know what to expect in the coming months as we research and gather information about all of the work they've been doing. And so staff were engaged directly and early on through the development of the reporting framework and asked for feedback on the visuals of how it's presented, as well as the content that was included. And this occurred throughout the life cycle of the tracking report development. The primary research materials that were used to provide content include past board narrative reports, progress monitoring frameworks. So the content is based on that framework that we just delved into. Strategic action plans, as well as grant applications and reports. So this is all grounded in the technical information provided by each FIP. And to verify facts, FIPs were engaged directly on specific questions as well as photo requests. And so they reviewed initial content through looking at a Word document as well as reviewing spreadsheet metrics so they could see understand how we were measuring and tracking the progress they were making. And as more draft reports were developed, so sort of an iterative process that built on one another, a standardized approach to design evolved through staff collaboration that could meet the needs of a variety of partnerships. Of course, these are all different ecosystems and strategies, but we needed a template that could accurately express the progress that each partnership was making. And partnerships and staff provided feedback on all the final PDFs, including FIP staff, the monitoring team, and executive director. And all edits were incorporated to finalize the report. So let's walk through the categories of information that are included in each tracking report. On page 1, you'll find a brief summary of the geography of each FIP, as well as the conservation challenge they are facing. There's a funding chart that shows investments by grant type, and then a brief summary of the ecological and socioeconomic benefits provided by each of the partnership's work. On page 2, you'll find a condensed theory of change. So the wiring diagram that you saw, this is a very, very concise summary of that general content within the wiring diagram. I would note the implementation highlights that are included in that condensed theory of change on page 2. We'll take a look at the stacked bar chart that shows progress on strategies. But I think one important thing to note is that as I delved into the research on each of the FIP and the progress they were making, this particular area was used as a place to highlight additional work that the FIP was completing that might not be directly shown within the strategies. So this could include outreach and other types of activities that just were occurring and need to be recognized, but not directly aligned in the theory of change. Okay. Page 3 has the strategic action plan progress, as well as a high-level summary of the monitoring approach. So you look at the general direction and strategy that each partnership is using to begin monitoring those objectives outlined in the crosswalk matrix. And then lastly, on page 4 is a summary of the adaptive management occurring. And this is used loosely as a term, but we're looking at lessons learned, challenges, and adaptations. And then finally on page 4, we have examples of before and after projects. So we're going to walk through a couple of the data visualizations so I can explain them in a little bit greater detail. So this one is found on page 4. And this visualizes the grant types and amounts awarded in Biennium 1. And what's interesting to compare across all the FIPs is each of the partnerships have a different mix of grant types to meet their needs, restoration strategies, and operational environments. So for example, in Willamette, they had 9 restoration grants in their first biennium, and in contrast, Harney Basin had 9 technical assistance grants. So you're kind of looking at the different focus and priorities of each FIP as you look at the bar chart. So it really shows the uniqueness of each partnership. So this slide shows a real high level of the theory of change, but again, this is based on their progress monitoring framework, and it's a condensed summary of the goals, strategies, actions, and outcomes expected. If you look at page 3, we're going to look a little bit closely at the strategic action plan stacked bar chart. So these stacked bar charts visualize the output metrics associated with each strategy that the partnerships accomplished. So they're a way to visualize progress over time, and you can see that the partnerships have completed a tremendous amount of work in the compressed time frame of Biennium 1. And progress in these metrics will be tracked over time and visualized to show incremental progress as more acres, upland acres are treated, more stream miles are restored, and we'll be able to see how that plays out within the next biennia. And you will also see additional bar charts. So as more projects are implemented, more strategies will be implemented, and you're going to see more metrics show up to document that progress that they're making. And lastly, the adaptive management matrix. So this is meant to be read horizontally, and it shares the challenges, lessons learned, and adaptations, and is color-coded by activity type. You'll definitely notice, though, some patterns as you read from up to down between relationships between challenges, lessons learned, and adaptations. And it provides incredibly useful information to reflect on the operational challenges that each FIP is facing. I mean, they've often had to pivot on strategies, overcome barriers, and respond to new information as they're doing this work. And this may affect their ability to make progress and may require different allocation of resources to overcome those challenges. So this is a place to take a look at a very high level what is occurring in that environment and to appreciate all the close coordination and the important part that strong partnership plays in the success of each FIP. Partnerships have indicated that the flexibility of the FIP program and the partnership of OWEB staff has been important to successfully respond to the dynamic environment and a new program that they're implementing. So in conclusion, our intent is to combine presenting the tracking reports with biennial reporting, individual partnership presentations, and we're still working out the details of the timing.
Thanks, Lisa. For the record, Renee Davis. Before we move to the last slide, I just want to highlight, so the challenges, lessons learned, adaptations piece of the progress tracking reports, they are specific to each one of the FIP partnerships, but we see great opportunity for peer-to-peer sharing. So for example, being able to have some space at the FIP gathering to talk through what have the different FIPs who have been at this for nearly 3 biennia now, what have they experienced, and help to use that to inform some of the newer partnerships that are coming online. So just quick wrap up, wanted to recap the tools. So first, the generic ecological priority theories of change. So again, that's at the priority, the ecological priority level for the 7 priorities you all established. A very user-friendly way to understand the connections between actions and outcomes through time. The progress monitoring frameworks, individual partnerships, providing that consistent framework to really serve as a foundation, making sure that it is grounded in theory of change, but then also having the potential to use that to inform things like the progress tracking reports that Lisa described. So weaving these pieces together, and the progress tracking reports giving us the ability to see that incremental progress. You'll be seeing more of these in the future as we report on subsequent biennia, but making sure it's grounded in the progress monitoring frameworks, but showing you the real world results and experiences that the FIP partnerships are having. So with that, any of us would be happy to take questions.
All right, any questions? And thank you, Renee. That was a lot of material, and you guys saved us some time, so thank you very much for that. Questions? Bruce?
I just wanted to compliment the entire staff on this, particularly you see these things through your career, and a lot of them are really pretty. And everybody compliments people on how pretty they are, and then they don't get used. But I think these will be used. I particularly love the adaptive management part of the progress report. It's clear-eyed, self-critical. It doesn't sugarcoat problems, and when they're not sugar-coated, they generally get fixed. So thank you.
Other questions? Jamie?
First of all, this is the most phenomenal tool I've ever seen that I think serves, excuse me, all different types of brains, from the big picture to the detail of the metrics to the, as Bruce was saying, the candid, here's some of the challenges and here's what we're dealing with, and the different tools you develop. It's really the most phenomenal tool I've ever seen to work with, to work on this incredibly complex, that you need that big picture perspective, and you also need the detail on the ground. It's truly remarkable. I'm just curious in how it looks like you've got your hands around working with the partners in the field on specific issues, and then working forward, sometimes 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, whatever it is, but working with those teams in the field. What I'm curious about is going back to the very first, the big picture planning document. Are you finding challenges that go beyond the FIP area to some of the bigger picture, perhaps even partner agencies? And do we need to be having some kind of conversation statewide with our other partner agencies? So one of the things that just jumped out at me when I was looking at attachment B, the theory of change document, and the closed lake basin wetlands. And one of the pieces for migratory birds said flood irrigated wetlands and wetland meadows support wetland birds. So makes a lot of sense, and it's a great statement. And the first thing that jumped to mind for me was, well, water conservation measures, the first thing that you hear for ag is don't flood irrigate, use, sprinklers, low flow sprinklers, and minimize. So it's in direct contrast to this goal to achieve this objective. And so that's not, that, is a conversation in the field with farmers and with irrigators, but it's also almost a conversation more with, Department of Water Resources. So do we have to, on some of these big picture views, do we also need to take a step back and have some of those conversations with our partner agencies? Or how do we get everyone on this overall page and overall agenda? Because I think you've done a phenomenal job of really thinking it through and laying it out. But are there bigger picture steps we need to take? And then I guess I would ask to the chair and to Meta, what's the process for doing that?
Thanks for that, Jamie. I'm happy to start, and then would be really interested in particular Eric Hartstein, given the example you use, or even Gary, since he knows that area well. So for the record, Renee Davis, I would say that most, if not all, of the FIPs from the outset of developing not only their strategic action plan, but also their kind of 6-year FIP bite, were highly aware of the things that you were talking about. So that was part of the conversation from early on with the Harney Basin folks. We've got to push to, switch from flood irrigated to pivots. Well, that's a problem given some of the ecological outcomes that we're looking for with this particular FIP. So how do you make sure you've got the outreach necessary? Do we have that solved? I would say no, because we are seeing some pretty significant transitions in some areas of Harney County over to pivots, and there are a whole host of issues attached to that Gary described yesterday. But I think that the local partners were quite aware of that. I think, where we can, within the FIP investment context, help to enable some of those conversations, we certainly are willing and have been doing that. So Eric, I don't know if you have some, any particular specific examples of some of those interagency pieces that you might be able to share?
Yeah, thanks, Renee. For the record, Eric Hartstein, particularly with the Harney Basin Wetlands Initiative, it's a very large partnership, as Gary can attest to. And on our technical review team, we actually have Water Resource Department, who's looking at these applications and participating in the quarterly meetings as well. So I think it covers both the state and federal agencies at a pretty high level there.
One other quick piece that I might mention, Jamie, back to this operational context portion of the progress monitoring frameworks. One thing we've heard about consistently, I think from most, if not all of the FIPS, is this challenge of ongoing monitoring. They recognize it's going to take a long time to get to some of those ecological outcomes. And so how, beyond our 6-year FIP investment, when monitoring is not the most, is not the sexiest thing, how do we make sure, how are they making sure that they have resources to be able to demonstrate that progress towards ecological outcomes? So that's another piece that's come up, and we, under the sage grouse context, have been in discussions with Fish and Wildlife Service about what is that kind of a longer term plan that at the agency level we can be exploring.
Yeah, for the record, Andrew Dutter, OWEB staff. Thanks for the question, Jamie. And I guess one other piece I would add is that what we've seen with some of the development FIP groups in the past, now partnership TA collaborations, is that one of the first, for those partnerships that are just convening to draft a strategic action plan, one of the first big barriers or obstacles that they face is simply, where do we begin? And so I think these outlines here provide some concepts, some ideas on exactly the types of things to be thinking about when they start putting together that strategic action plan. So it can be really helpful in that sense. And then even taking that a step further, also thinking about those partnerships that are interested in applying then, once they have a strategic action plan for a FIP initiative, it provides some guidelines on how to be thinking about structuring their initiative. And it may also help identify, as Renee and Eric described, some potentially other partners or other aspects that they would want to incorporate into that initiative to pursue that work.
Okay, Maida, then I have Liza Jane, Randy, and Alan, and then we'll wrap this one up.
So for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, speaking to your second question about how do we get to that bigger conversation. One of the things we're seeing, and I'll give a quick example. When I worked for NRCS in 2003, we did exactly what you said, $50 million of bright, shiny pipe in the Klamath, only to find out from a USGS survey that flood irrigation was feeding the Klamath River later in the system. And now that great efficiency left no water in the system later. And what I've seen over time, actually, I think we collectively are in this, starting to be in that space that you're looking for. The place-based planning work, the 4 of those that are in the state, the partnership technical assistance that we talked about yesterday in reference. We have had strong encouragement, both Water Resources and OWEB, from our partner agencies, that these planning efforts are daylighting some of those things. So rather than saying, here's the $50 million, we know irrigation efficiency is the solution, forcing this planning process, investing in this planning process, and the funders' encouragement, whether it's Water Resources or OWEB, that, boy, you're going to be better positioned if you go through these planning processes, is starting to daylight some of those things about what happens to the groundwater. Why do we find these depressions that are sucking more water out? It forces them to think through it. It's one of the reasons that both we, Water and Water Resources, are pretty passionate about the fact that we can invest in planning, and so we want to keep doing that. I think the challenge is, do you have the right people at the table to hear the message? So I think we're still struggling with a lot of that.
Okay. Liza Jane?
Liza Jane, for the record. I align with Bruce on this. I really, can I have your caramels? No, the adaptive management piece, I love this so much, and I think it'll be a great tool when you all gather up and share solutions and challenges. Are you planning to capture that somehow? When one group can say, hey, here's a solution, and then it can be included in a report somehow that, because that'll be some jewels, probably.
For the record, Renee Davis. So we currently ask about lessons learned in our project completion reporting. It's very standard regardless of the program that's being funded. But part of the benefit of Lisa having gone through the process with the first 6 FIPS is we now can present to new FIPS. This is the type of information we are really interested in capturing in these progress tracking reports and get them proactively thinking about how do we begin to document that in the midst of a biennium. So there is hope, and even giving them some tools to do that tracking, so that we have a set of information that we can pop into here and then look across those to determine, is there roll-up potential? Are we seeing some common themes that we really need to daylight? Because some are very partnership-specific, but others, we likely would expect some commonality across and want to highlight those pieces. And the other piece I just want to say really quickly is that it is so important, and we so appreciate how open our FIP partners have been. They are being very transparent about the challenges they face. Sometimes that is concerning to share with a funder, and we so appreciate their openness and honesty. And I think it will be really wonderful to be able to say to them how much the board appreciates hearing that and how useful that is for all of you.
Okay, great. And Randy, Alan, and then we should move to the next item. Oh, Gary, did you have?
Go ahead.
Randy Labby for the record. From a complete layman's standpoint, this is really cool, and congratulations. My question relates to your communication plan on this. I assume this will be readily available to the public on your website, but have you given, do you have a plan as far as directing these reports to entities that we would like to have them made known to?
Quickly for the record, Renee Davis. Well, certainly we would be sharing this, for example, with our partners at NOAA Fisheries for those salmonid FIP investments that we're making, and other partners such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS. Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the discussions you've had with the FIP partnerships about their use of the progress tracking reports?
Thank you. Yes. For the record, Lisa Apple. One of the pieces of engagement with the individual FIPs is having this two-way communication about the progress tracking reports. And so I've asked them to communicate with me how they are using them as a partnership, because if they can be utilized in multiple levels at the board level to communicate with local stakeholders, elected officials, others, then it increases their utility. And also we might be able to refine the content further as we better understand the audience for it. And so I have begun tracking their use, and we'll be, looking at that, reflecting on it, adapting the report in our planning process. And so we'll also be looking at more broadly a communications plan and looking at the progress tracking reports as a tool, and then are there potentially other formats for this information that could also be useful for a variety of audiences.
That's good. I think that if legislators in the district see this and county commissioners, it just makes them more aware of the value that their area is receiving.
Real quickly, Alan.
Alan Henning for the record. Just want to say quickly, my compliments to the staff and to BEF for all of this work. This has really evolved into a very valuable tool we'll use as long as the FIP program is going. And part of the genesis of this was making sure that we were able to defend changing from open competition grants to a more collaborative FIP program. And this tool will do that for us, and a lot more. So thank you very much for all your work.
Okay. And Gary, you had one last comment here.
This is Gary Marshall for the record. I just want to say I think that this is just, we've taken this, I guess, from a concept to a real organized, measurable venture, and I think it's fabulous. I just had one thought when I was kind of reading through this. That, I like the theory of change part of this, and I would just suggest that maybe there's a possibility of even expanding that beyond where we're at right now, and that's the benefit to the whole climate change issue, maybe, and what is the net carbon atmospheric load created here from these efforts, and
I'm just thinking in terms of like, so we do a stream repair and that causes a reconnection to the floodplain, and that causes fine silt deposits, and that causes grass and things built, and so you have a soil or a carbon sequestration occurring, and that offsets all the carbon you spent by having the excavator in the stream fixing the stream. So what is the net that is occurring from all of this? And so I'd like to see that factored into like the theory of change at some point in time. Okay.
Be sure to
No extra
we'll be
work.
sure to let our applicants know that Gary wants carbon balance in their applications.
Take that to rulemaking.
So in all seriousness, thank you, Gary, for that. I think these kinds of logic processes are really helpful in so many different forums and projects, yeah.
So for the record, Jason Robinson, thank you very much, Renee and the team. Very good job, and we'll move on to the next item.
Thank you, guys. So Randy Labby, for the record, we're going to move on to tab S, open solicitation grant offering. This is just a first reading and discussion. There's no action, and Eric Williams will
right through it.
describe the possible action.
Alan, Barbara and I thought you made a great point. We just wanted to let you know. Do you remember the point you made?
No.
Yeah, but it was great. we both got it.
I'll make sure I know that.
It's not, this isn't working. Uh-oh.
We're not going to let anything, Nikki?
No. I think the big note was the agreement between Liza Jane and
That was what I was worried about.
Nikki's going to look for batter.
That was a major red flag.
Wait, there, that. You got that. There. It's all about the caramels.
Wait, there's more.
It's my static.
There's a slight technical glitch to delay us a little bit.
we can have a song from Brittany when we
For the record, Eric Williams, my apologies for the technical difficulties. Co-chairs, members of the board, this, as Randy said, is an informational item regarding our open solicitation calendar. And following that dynamic presentation about the FIPS, I'm a little nervous about this one. So I'll just start by saying with this one, we are talking about 55% of the spending plan. So let's start there. And as you know, we solicit for open solicitation projects twice a year. We have 6-month granting cycles that currently result in both receipt of applications and board awards in the months of April and October. In between the receipt of the application and the board award, we have a fairly extensive and rigorous vetting process, as you know, that results in the thick package of evaluations that you get each time you're asked to approve those open solicitation awards. In the spirit of continuous improvement, which is something that Mark Grenbemmer and his fellow RPRs, led by Liz Redon, have been working on, we wanted to talk to you about our open solicitation calendar. And just as an example of that kind of spirit of continuous improvement, an example of that is the bubble diagrams that we frequently reference and talk about here. That resulted from a realization over time that our technical review teams, and of the 6 teams, that represents about 90 professional staff from various agencies, including those represented on this board. Over time, we realized that the technical reviewers, while generally familiar with evaluation criteria, weren't really referring to them consistently, and we weren't guiding them to refer to them consistently. And so it led to the production of that graphic display of what's in our administrative rules, to the point now where a couple of cycles into it, the reviewers are just automatically referring to their bubble diagrams as they're making comments during review. So one of the things that we have noticed over time is that our schedule does have some potential barriers in it. And this is fresh on my mind, having done 2 of the review team meetings just last week, one in John Day and one in Bend. Because of the winter storm that some of you have already talked about driving through, Kathy Leopold from our office and I left for our tour on Monday in a snowstorm. We happened to hit a decent gap to get over the pass and to the east side, but it was snowing hard. It wasn't white out. The road was full of snowpack. It was not icy, so it wasn't entirely dangerous, but it very well could have. We made it. However, at both of those review teams, there were reviewers who decided not to travel to the review team due to safety concerns. And safety is one of the constraints that we've been thinking about and looking at as we've been evaluating our open solicitation calendar and deliberating internally about whether or not these things are adding up to the point where we've got critical mass to really talk about making a change here. And so in this slide, in addition to winter travel, we have a number of other seasonal constraints that come into play throughout our application processing cycle. Those obviously include holidays, big ones obviously around Thanksgiving and Christmas, but also 4th of July, end of school year. That week is a common time for folks with kids to take off on vacation. Fire season sometimes calls reviewers and folks who work for our grantee agencies away to help fight fire. There are in-water work windows. That one is challenging because I think in some parts of the state we're used to thinking of those as, yeah, that's the dry months of the summer. But actually, when you look at the ODFW calendar of in-water work windows, there's an in-water work window in every month of the year. However, they are commonly in the drier months, July, August, in a lot of parts of the state. And those in-water work windows often necessitate staff from our grantee agencies to be out in the field working on projects as opposed to working on their applications. And so when we mapped all of that out on a calendar, we looked at our schedule and realized that if we can, it would benefit the fairness and equitability of our process to avoid the key points in this process of site visits and regional review team meetings. If we could avoid having those in the winter months, December, January, February, and avoid those during the common in-water work window, holiday, fire season months of June, July, August, we would set ourselves up to have a more consistent participatory process in review. And so when we charted that out on this dartboard-looking graphic here, the windows that we tried to avoid led us to a proposed grant offering schedule here that shows you in blue the times of the year when our regional program representatives and our grantees can schedule site visits, in red when regional review team meetings can happen, and then in green our evaluation writing process that leads to the board award. And so looking at our optimal time here on this proposed calendar, you'll see that it basically flips the current cycle by 3 months, so that applications and board awards would happen, they would be submitted in January and July, and board awards would happen in January and July. That would allow us to avoid December, January, and we could avoid February in the snowier regions for site visits because we'd still have time, March, April, early May for those in that cycle. And it allows us to avoid June and July, and we could potentially avoid August as well if that's a challenging period of time for site visits in the schedule that begins with a July application. And as a result, what this would lead to in terms of our transition process, because we have to think about how this impacts our spending plan, how this impacts the time between application cycles, as Vanessa mentioned in her comments earlier this morning. It does mean that when we transition, we will have a different gap. Rather than 6 months, it would be 9 months in between those consecutive application cycles. And the other thing we have to consider is the impact on our spending plan, because what we do when we allocate funds for each cycle is we take what's in the spending plan and divide it by the number of cycles in the biennium. So we take typically for restoration projects, for example, each time we come to you with recommended awards for restoration projects, we're shooting for 1/4 of what's in the spending plan. When we transition this, there will be one biennium that would only have 3 awards in it instead of 4. And so that would require us to divide the spending plan essentially in thirds. So we're evening out the impact on spending funds. We're not going to have one cycle that has twice as much money in it, for example. If we do this by the biennium, we can transition it so that we have an increased amount of funds with fewer cycles in one biennium and then get on to a regular cycle or schedule in the succeeding one. And so in this graphic here, it shows the current biennium on the left in the gray, and gives you the amounts in the spending plan, which I know you can't read, but it's really just for graphic illustration purposes, where you've got the 4 cycles with 1/4 of the spending plan by each grant type. The transition biennium would be 2021 to the 2021-2023 biennium, where that's the first time that awards would shift from happening in October, April to January, July. And so you'll see that that would result in a 9-month gap in awards between April of 2021 and January of 2022. The other thing that we're trying to think about here in conceptualizing this and determining whether to implement it is having a long enough period of transition and planning so that our applicants and grantees have plenty of notice for this and can plan ahead for it. And so if we start down this path now, we'll still have a couple more application cycles under the current schedule until that transition period hits in January of 22, which actually would start during the application phase, so that the first time it would be a different application month would be in July of 2021. So about 1.5 years from now is when that change will be implemented. And so we wanted to come to you to explain this as really the kickoff to our conversations. We didn't want to go ahead and start exploring this with our grantees before making you aware of it. So you didn't get phone calls from people saying, hey, why are you guys changing this? And you say, what are you talking about? So this really is the beginning of the potential change, the prospective change. And we didn't want to set this up as a process to determine when we should do it, because we felt we had enough information, given those constraints that I explained earlier, to identify the windows that we wanted to avoid. And we're not going to propose to you changing your board meeting months. We did not want to do that to you. And so keeping with the current months that we have board meetings and looking at those times of the year we wanted to avoid, there really aren't a lot of options or choices here. So it's not like we can lay out, here's your 3 options, what do you like best? This really would be the change we would have to make if we wanted to address those barriers that we identified to a consistent process. And so, of course, that leads to, okay, how do we do the engagement on this? And Vanessa mentioned that we had a conversation earlier about it. What we are planning to do with this going forward is to have a focus group first of grantees from across our 6 regions, probably 2 grantees from each of the 6 regions, so a focus group of 12, to walk through what I just walked through with you, and then ask if there's anything that we missed in our thinking. Are there any unintended consequences of making this change? And the other thing that we would want to talk through with them is, if we make this change, what are the things we can do to help you during the transition? Then we would use that focus group feedback to do broader engagement with all of our grantees around the state, either through survey mechanisms or direct conversations or webinars or whatever the most appropriate technique is. But we wanted to start with that focus group input to make sure that we're spending some focused time and detailed time with people who are intimately familiar with our process, so that we can flesh out those anything that might come up as a really challenging issue or barrier to implementing this transition before we go into that broader level of engagement. So with that, I think I'll stop there and see if folks have questions.
Bruce?
I appreciate the fact you're beginning those discussions. I'm curious if there's any cascading effect at the board level, assuming we make decisions on other programs in January and July.
Yes.
And what does that do to the agenda by taking this? Are we going to have to move other things to adjust our agenda to deal with January, July open solicitation?
Thank you. For the record, Eric Williams, yes, there will be impacts of that nature. Some actually are positive, some are more challenging. So, for example, in every other April's board meeting, we have the open solicitation awards currently, but we also have a really detailed walkthrough of the next biennium's proposed spending plan, which takes a big chunk of agenda time. So that will ease that agenda conflict. Where it creates more pressure on the agenda would be every other January, where we're inviting the implementation FIP partnerships in to give you their updates, so that you can decide for the next biennium whether to continue their future biennium spending proposal, whether there's carryover funds, those kind of things, getting that gauge on their progress. So that would put some pressure on the every other January board meeting.
Debbie and Tony?
Thanks, Eric. So my question, and I know that you have considered it, but you just didn't talk about it. So how does the fiscal year, the state fiscal year, play into when the money comes and goes and how the award processes work? I know sometimes we have conversations around if we get that money because of the timing of when we're doing things. So how does that play here?
For the record, Eric Williams, the state fiscal year is July to June, and so we operate the open solicitation spending program within the biennium spending plan. And so the biennium begins in July, and during the transition biennium, we effectively would not be spending those funds for the first 6 months of the biennium. That first award would hit in January, where ordinarily it would that first spending would hit in October. But we're still going to allocate all of each biennium spending plan, and as I said earlier, there's just that one transition biennium that will have 3 award dates instead of 4.
And Maida Lofsgarden, for the record, the only other funky thing that will happen, but I think it will mostly be fine because of how many times we touch the spending plan. So starting, is that right? Yeah, starting this coming October is your first hit at the spending plan, and then the following January, the following April, and you approve the following July. So you have a lot of time in the spending plan, but your agenda will be agenda item B, approve the spending plan, agenda item C, start spending the spending plan. And so it again can be worked out, and I feel comfortable because by that point you've spent 9 months, 4 meetings in that spending plan. But we always have the spending plan changes last minute based on what the revenues are. So there is a little bit of that, always that odd July. Will be a little bit of a negotiation around the spending plan, but again, we think it's something we can manage.
Tony.
Tony Sully for the record. Thanks, Eric. Good job walking us through that and showing the logic on that. I just wanted to comment that I've heard already from one of the reviewers on the federal side that the change of schedule might be a problem for them. So one of the unanticipated consequences are maybe just the difference in fiscal years may be an issue. So September is is the end of our fiscal year, and tends to be a busier time of wrapping everything up. So just I know you have a next steps of reaching out to the reviewers, but I wanted to give you that feedback.
So September being a busy time, so it might be
It's
best
closed
to
out.
avoid site visits and a review team meeting in September, basically.
Yeah, they tend to be fairly busy.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Jamie.
Thank you. Jamie McLeod Skinner. Really appreciate the effort to be more responsive to our partners, and that is a goal. What came to mind when you were talking about some of the partner agencies and some of the conversations we've had earlier in the day and yesterday is these smaller organizations that are very dependent, have one person and go through feast and famine cycles. And so I had a concern that there may be if they're not capturing those finances, even that 3-month difference may be the difference between them keeping or losing a staff member. So I would just encourage you, when you're reaching out, I appreciate the geographical diversity you're bringing into your focus group, but also look at different size agencies. Sounds like there may be issues for very large agencies, but larger agencies will also be able to withstand that 3-month difference, whereas a very small organization might not be able to.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Eric.
Okay.
For the record, Jason Robinson, we're going to go ahead and move on to item T. It's action item for the Organ-Ag Heritage Program updates. And this will include votes on reappointing members. Eric's going to stay up here for this one.
Thank you. Members of the board, I apologize I didn't show my last slide, which includes a photo of Kelly, who's sitting in the back room. Okay, thank you. This one has no presentation, thankfully. This is an update on Oregon Ag Heritage Program, and there's really two components to this. One is an action item, one is an informational item. The action item simply consists of reappointments. When the commission was first created, the 4-year terms of the commissions were staggered so that some had 1-year terms, some had 2, some had 3, some had 4, so that the whole commission wouldn't be up for reappointment at the same time. And since we got started with you appointing the commissioners in January of 2017 or 18, I forget, 18, I think, we now have ourselves on a pattern of approving commissioners every January, a subset of the commissioners. And this time around, we have 2 that are up for reappointment. Chad Allen, representing agriculture, and Dr. Sam Angema, representing the OSU Extension Service. Both have been recommended by their appointing or nominating agencies. Chad Allen through the Board of Agriculture, and Sam Angema through OSU Extension. And so we'll take, at the end of this presentation, a vote, entertain a motion on those appointments. The other item is just a simple program update. Last time we talked to you about the report that was completed with the remaining funds last biennium in the Ag Heritage Program's budget, which was a feasibility study on valuing the public benefits of implementing conservation management plans on agricultural lands. The report was well received. The report determined that there were quite a few practices that would be feasible to develop valuation methodologies for. And the Ag Heritage Program authorizing statute includes an authorization for a grant program to not only develop conservation management plans, but to potentially have a grant program to pay farmers to implement conservation management programs. And so this would be a necessary step to get that valuation methodology done if the commission is to have a budget for funding that grant program in the future, and then starts to solicit applications. And so we just wanted to update you that we are working on a funding proposal for taking the next step in that process, which is to actually develop the methodology, which may range in the ballpark of $100,000, $150,000, something like that. And we may also be seeking other sources, for example, through the NRCS's Conservation Innovation Grants Program, to help supplement any funds that we might ask the board to contribute to that work. And so with that, I'll entertain questions on either reappointments or the evaluation study.
Any questions? Okay, hearing none, I'll entertain a motion then for the approval of the appointees.
Randy Lowry, for the record, I approve, I recommend, I move that I'll approve as well. I move that the board reappoint to the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program Chad Allen and Dr. Sam Anjima.
All right, a motion by Randy, second by Mark. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay, Randy Labby for the record. We have finally item U, other business, so the board members can just determine if they have other business to bring to the board. But first, Maida's going to discuss future board venues.
Yes, actually, for the record, Maida Lofsgarden, I have a couple of just final updates for you. Most of these we've talked about before, one we have not. So I'll start with just a few reminders. One, Eric Hartstein will be working on putting together a spreadsheet for you to identify which committees you would like to serve on. And with that, we're going to take the notes. I haven't talked to Eric about this yet, but the notes, we will kind of turn them into this is what the committee considers so that you can look at those things and then make your ranking decisions. So that's one. Just a reminder that Nikki will be working to coordinate phone calls with you all, just annual check-ins. Your training, your harassment training, Bruce might want to take it a second time. So we have and you will be receiving an email for your very relevant IT security training that you should be taking through a YouTube video. Please complete those by the end of January. Also, just a note, I have been thinking through, as has Renee and probably Eric Hartstein, there is going to be a lot that comes at us between now and April with potential water funding, potential carbon funding, conversations about fire, et cetera. We will definitely have this as an agenda item in our April meeting for conversations. Typically in short session, we do not do the Friday check-in calls with board members because it's short session and we don't have anything. But I'm thinking that we might go ahead and kick that up for this session. So what we've done in the past is just a Friday morning, anybody can join in like at 9 to 10 in the morning. Call in, you can find out any of the legislative updates that are going on if you're interested, because April is actually a long ways out from when the session is over, and we want you to hear from us what we're hearing. So we'll probably institute those this time around. And then the last thing, Liza Jane is a big behind-the-scenes lobbyist. There had been some questions raised. Our next board meeting is set to be over in Enterprise. There had been some questions raised about that her place might not be pretty enough in April, and there are in April in that neck of the woods concerns around things like snow. So having camped there in the snow in April or May, we are having some conversations. I'm just going to lay out both pieces for you so you know where we may end up. Most likely, we're going to move the April board meeting to Clackamas. Clackamas, which was going to be when the July meeting was going to be in Clackamas. So moving that one to April, we can find good tours in April. I think there's a lot of things that we can do around the Clackamas area. There's also been a request from some of our amazing partners over in Tillamook County. They've asked both us and the Board of Agriculture if we might consider holding our board meetings in Tillamook this July. And because of some touring that they would like to do with us. So we're in conversations. If we did that, we would actually be able to have a joint meeting with the Board of Forestry for a portion, which is always a nice thing. We've done that with Board of Agriculture and others before. So we're right now in this funky space that our July meeting will either be in Enterprise or in Tillamook. And just based on conversations with the Board of Forestry in Tillamook County, then we would move the Enterprise one to next July or January. Whichever you prefer.
Come on home with me today.
They're the third Tuesday, Wednesday of the month. So whatever that is.
Part of it, yes.
Yeah. So more to come on that, but I would assume that, I would just expect that we're probably going to shift over to Clackamas for April based on those two options for July.
Okay, any other new business? Thank you all for your terrific input. It's just exciting to consider the added value of our new board members, and we're going to be adjourned. Is there directions, Eric, on lunch? Oh, over there. Gotcha. Thank you.
Randy, we should note that we're well ahead of schedule again, so good work.
Nikki, thank you for all your support. Really appreciate you.